Hey Tim,
Hey Matt, how are you, man?
doing all right? How you doing, my friend?
Yeah, not too bad. Just wolfed some breakfast. Um, and my wife is just bombing me with those Apple animations with pictures of our daughter from. She just sent one with a bunch of my dad and our daughter together as well.
Hmm.
So if I look like I might have been crying,
Mm. Yeah, those AI videos are pretty good. I've had a few of those. Uh,
Yeah, feel a little bit icky in a sense because it's so like, manufactured to get a reaction out of us. But I mean, of course it works. It's like very insipid music that they put with all these pictures of your loved ones, but then it's like, yeah, I love those people so much.
yeah, and just the added sort of like zoom into the photograph. It just like, yeah, it plays on those heartstrings.
Yeah, well, they know how to manipulate us for sure.
So, we've been we've been chatting for like 2 weeks about offline on WhatsApp about Hans Jonas,
Yeah.
the phenomenon of life. Um, my copy was dusty, but so it's been years. I think when I wrote Physics of the World Soul was the last time I read this book, so
Yeah.
2012-ish. Um,
Right. Yeah, I had skimmed it, or parts of it, I suppose. I don't know, probably 7, 8 years ago. And then this is probably my first like serious reading of it. Um, and yeah, well, lots to discuss.
yes. So maybe I could just offer a little bit of background about Jonas
Please.
to put this book in context, the phenomenon of life towards a philosophical biology, because he's not a philosopher of science, and I think, as we'll see, you I think rightly have some criticisms of his understanding of Darwin and the nuances of evolutionary biology. And so we should and will dig into that. But I also think it's important to note what Jonas's project is here. He's approaching, as he says in the preface, he's approaching the study of life from an existential point of view. He says it's an existential interpretation of biological facts, and
Mm,
he's coming out of um, a study with Heidegger directly of Heidegger's existential phenomenology. Jonas originally wanted to study with Edmund Husserl in the 1920s when he was a student, but instead ended up studying with Husserl's then student, Heidegger, and was profoundly influenced by Heidegger. But in the early 30s, Jonas had to flee Germany because the Nazis came to power. Heidegger famously pledged allegiance to the Führer, and Jonas went to um, what was then British-controlled Palestine. Eventually, he would fight in World War II with the British against the Nazis, and then he would return again to Israel to fight in 1948 and 49 in the war that founded Israel, that Palestinians call the Nakba. And
mm,
so, very interesting sort of moral complexities at play here, underlying, I think, the ethical urgency motivating a lot of what Jonas is up to. And, as we've discussed, it often occurs that when we have this sense of moral outrage, and then we rush to engage with uh, philosophical and scientific issues that are sort of emotional and our passion can sometimes cloud our treatment of the details
mm.
conceptually or factually that we're engaged with. And so I think we'll need to tease some of that apart. But Jonas's real concern, oh, so he does his doctorate on Gnosticism,
Yeah.
and so he's coming out of religious studies, and he sees some parallels to the way that modern materialism kind of mimics some of the deeper existential structure of Gnosticism and this sort of rise of nihilism that he associates with less with Darwin as a scientist and more with I would say, the cultural impact of Darwinism, its reception in the broader culture, which often distorted Darwin's um, careful empirical work and the nuances of his theory of natural selection. And so Jonas in one of the chapters we're reading, um, philosophical aspects of Darwinism, is approaching this again as an existential phenomenologist and as a philosopher of religion, looking at, I think, the broader cultural influences at the level of metaphysics, of Darwinism. And then he has another chapter that we'll get to, hopefully, asking, is God a mathematician, where he's criticizing the mechanistic philosophy and the ways that he sees Darwinism, again, sort of succumbing to the mechanistic influence, even though I think, as you'll argue, there's something Platonic about mechanistic philosophy that Darwin actually tries to and allows us to overcome. And Jonas hints about that too, overcoming Cartesian dualism and whatnot, the way that, Darwin's understanding of a continuity between the human being, having descended from animals, um, requires overcoming a Cartesian dualism. And so he's not simply rejecting Darwin. Um, so yeah, I think just laying out that context helps us understand where Jonas is coming from. But maybe you could say a bit about your uh, overall reaction to these chapters as a biologist who does care about those nuances and salvaging Darwin from neo-Darwinism, say.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that you've given that context. It's very important, and I also did come across Jonas sort of independently in the context of being interested in Gnosticism. So and April de Konik's work, and so there are interesting convergences, and he's doing a lot as a thinker. I suppose he's trying to cover a lot of ground, but in these chapters that we've read, he is putting together a very strong, I mean, the tenor of it, the tone of it is very strong. Whether the content is as strong is perhaps what we're going to get into. Critique of the mechanical philosophy and of the way he sees Darwinism, um, simultaneously, and I'd give him some credit for sure for this nuance where he gets to at the end of the philosophical aspects of Darwinism chapter, and you mentioned that in the kind of overcoming of Cartesianism, but he sees Darwinism simultaneously as the triumph of the mechanical philosophy, of the final subjugation of life to mechanism, but also the beginning of the end of mechanical philosophy in an important way. And I see it very much more in terms of the latter. And I think that it's clearly a very complex history, the way Darwin's thought was appropriated by diverse movements, and maybe we'll get into some of the sociopolitical stuff. We'll touch on it as well, because again, as you've said, that's very much imminent in uh, Jonas's concerns here. But there is a complex history, of course, the way that Darwin's thought was appropriated by certain paradigms in scientific thought, the mechanical philosophy, etc. But I think in accepting the received view then of Darwin's thought, rather than engaging in, say, like a close reading, so far as I can see, of like The Origin of Species or, of Darwin's own work, Jonas is content to use the name Darwin, and the notion of a Darwinian thought or Darwinism without engaging, as far as I can see, with Darwin. He's content to use that in a way that is taking on that received view from people who may have branded themselves as, Darwinian or Darwinists, but were in many ways, and they thought that they were improving on Darwin's thought, and they were enabling its deeper integration into the mechanical philosophy. And that's science, right? To some people, that's what we should be aiming towards. But what they're really doing is, not quite in a Deleuzian sense, but buggering Darwin, and actually excising some of the most important achievements of Darwin's thought, in my view. And so there's going to be a lot of nitty-gritty here. And like I've said to you in private, I have, and I'm always making this apology, but I have very copious notes here. Um, that I haven't, had time to put them together into a really cohesive format. It's just, annotations all over the book. And Jonas throws out like a constant series of assertions about what science is, about what the mechanical philosophy is, about what Darwinism is. And sometimes he's got, a rhetorical flourish, he'll wax very poetic. Other times he is making a very straight assertion, like this is what this thought indicates or entails, or whatever, and teasing apart all of those details because it's not really systematic. And interestingly, and maybe we'll get to this because I assume we're going to talk about Darwin quite a bit. Darwin's thought is a little bit like that too, because Darwin isn't really a systematic thinker, in my opinion. He's a principled thinker, so he's thinking in terms of principles, but he doesn't really systematize all of his extrapolations from those principles. So, if you read The Origin of Species, he contradicts himself all the time. And sometimes it's just like a matter of emphasis. But here he'll be saying, this factor is incredibly important. And 2 pages later, he'll be, marginalizing that factor, in evolution and whatever, although never using the term evolution in the first or second edition of The Origin of Species, of course. So it becomes a really, really complex task to do justice to these texts, either Jonas or Darwin, for that matter. And I really do want to signal, because I could be very critical of Jonas for some of the things that he says, which I think are complete mischaracterizations. Um, but I also do want to signal that, I've done my best in my annotations, and I would hope that that will come out to some degree in the dialogue, to signal all the points where I really strongly agree with what he says, because I do really agree with a lot of what Jonas is saying. But I think it's really important to get the critique right, like the critique of the mechanical philosophy, for example. It needs to be right, um, or as accurate as possible, so that we don't keep circulating, in this same kind of, rhetorical atmosphere which doesn't really enable us to move beyond arguably we are moving out of that slowly in biology and in science more broadly. But I think we can probably move more incisively beyond that paradigm if our critiques are more like systematic and more precise. And I simply don't think Jonas provides that for us. And so I think that just one really quick example would be that he keeps saying that Darwin, like the mechanical philosophy is anti-teleological, that it removes all telos from our conception of the cosmos, and that Darwinism is part of the crowning achievement of that because it removes telos from life as well, whereas life had been the last bastion of, some sort of notion of finalism, of goals, of purposes, etc., in the sort of natural world. And that's just a total mischaracterization of in my opinion, of both the mechanical philosophy, which is teleocratic. We'll get to that. So it has telos completely built into it. And also Darwin, who is actually showing his real project is the naturalization of purpose and giving an account of the way teloi, as opposed to a single overarching telos, as you have in the mechanical philosophy, which it inherits from its theological context. Darwin shows us the imminent emergence of goals, goals plural, teloi, in local contexts. That is the logic of evolutionary biology. That is the logic of Darwin's thought. You cannot actually think natural selection without thinking about, purpose, basically. And we get into some details there. So I think, when Jonas keeps saying that this is the final extinguishing of the view that there might be telos or teleology or whatever in the natural world. We can talk about the difference between teleology and teleonomy if we want. Um, Though I don't particularly think we need teleonomy as such, but it's there for some people who are allergic to the notion of teleology.
Right.
Um, so these are just these imprecisions in Jonas's account, which I think don't enable us, even though again he does eventually get to saying how Darwinian thought is a step in the overcoming of Cartesianism, because as you say, it breaks down that dualism in Cartesianism, because it shows that, well, if humans are themselves embedded within nature and have emerged from this natural process of evolution, then their minds must have too, so they can't be radically discontinuous with nature. So he signals that, but I don't think he gets to the root of the way that Darwin provides the pathway to the overcoming of the natural philosophy of the mechanical philosophy, which is precisely in this reinstalling of purpose in nature, and in particular getting out of the conception that purpose would have to somehow be globally imposed externally. And I think this is what we're going to talk about as well, because there's this characterization of Darwin as basically saying, well, the environment is the real agent, and the organism has nothing to contribute to its own evolutionary development. And I don't think that's at all right for Darwin. Even if some, again, so-called Darwinians or Darwinists might have seen things that way. But it's important that those people wanted to assimilate biology, Darwin and biology, to their understanding of reductionist science, because they thought that that was what rigorous science was. That is not what Darwin was doing. And he didn't have that same conception of science. He's not really engaging in physics envy, let's say, right? Um, he's just describing the phenomena as he sees them, and he's not a speculative ontologist or whatever. He's leaving a lot of these bigger questions open. Um, so yeah, look, there's a lot there, and that was probably not a particularly lucid exposition, but there are
Well,
many devils in the details.
yeah, well, that's great because I wanted to actually turn to the question of teleology initially because um, my understanding of Darwin philosophically, and I think this was, I can't remember what I might have read that gave me this impression. It was before I had read Jonas, but Darwin studies with William Paley, and Paley's the theologian, and develops a natural theology based on this thought experiment of finding a watch on the beach, and it implies he argues for an argument from design that watches, like organisms, display such a harmony between the parts and the whole that only some divine being could have designed this. And Darwin seems to me, um, and perhaps you will correct this as a caricature, but it seems to me that there's a similarity in the logic here in terms of teleology being imposed from outside. And you've already corrected um, Jonas, what you think is Jonas's misreading about, as he puts it, external conditions being the chief agency in evolution. Maybe Darwin was obviously acknowledging the survival instinct of organisms and the selection that comes through sexual selection, and so he's attributing some forms of agency to the organism. But it seems to me fair to at least say the emphasis by Darwin and certainly by neo-Darwinians was that it's the external conditions of the environment that play a role similar to what, um, again, structurally, the way that Paley attributed design to an external deity, kind of deism. In Darwin, it's nature or the environment that's imposing design haphazardly. As Jonas puts it, um, there are haphazard possibilities offered by organic instability in the organism itself. And then natural selection operates as what he calls a negative substitute for teleology, which he says can account for the disappearance of forms, but not for the emergence of novel forms. Um, and so it seems like all the way going back to Aristotle, what you're referring to as like immanent teleology was fully affirmed by Aristotle. That's Aristotle's view, actually, that purpose is immanent in nature. You even see this in Plotinus when he talks about logoi, plural, present in wholes, living organisms operating, and yes, subservient in some sense to logos as such, but there is still an account in even a Neoplatonist like Plotinus of a distribution of logos into the logoi at various locales in the living world. And similarly, Aristotle makes this key distinction between immanent teleology and um, artificial or extrinsic teleology, which, is his distinction between organisms and machines. Machines are designed from the outside, have their purposes imprinted on them by the human designer, whereas organisms have their purpose internally realized. And there's a kind of entelechy at work there, which I think clearly Jonas is trying to recover and recuperate a kind of holomorphic thinking, though with a processual spin on it. And so I want to say more about the way that I think Jonas is attempting an integration of Aristotle's emphasis on ontogeny, or what used to be called evolution, a kind of preformation of the individual organism moving through stages of development from, seed to adult form, that or egg to adult form. Uh, Integrate that ancient view with the modern Darwinian view, emphasizing phylogenesis and um, the lack of a global teleology guiding speciation. Darwin doesn't have as much to say about ontogeny, more about phylogeny. Again, I'm talking about emphases here, and it seems to me that there is maybe something we could salvage about, dare I say, the preformationist view or the OG evolutionary view, even if we want to get rid of a plan in advance that then is deterministically realized. We want to get rid of that kind of external teleology, but there's something about the purposiveness of ontogeny and development, as we would refer to it nowadays, and the open-endedness and sort of open diversification of phylogenesis and speciation that Darwin is emphasizing. But yeah, this issue of teleology is what I'm saying totally unfair to say that there's an emphasis on the external conditions in Darwin.
Well, it's not unfair to say that there's an emphasis. It would be unfair to say that there was a neglect or a eliding of the contribution of the individual organism. But it's not unfair to say that there's an emphasis, and it wouldn't be unfair to say that Darwin relativizes the two poles that you're sort of describing here. But there are a lot of, I don't want to keep saying devils in the details. So yeah, look, Darwin is obviously influenced by natural theology. He's obviously strongly influenced by Paley. And of course, famously, he begins the book on natural selection, on the origin of species, with a discussion of artificial selection, a detailed discussion of variation in domesticated organisms, including plant cultivars. And he uses that as a strong analogy for then providing his discussion of variation in nature, variation under natural conditions, and then moving into the role of natural selection. One thing that is just really important to signal from the very beginning in this kind of discussion is what is the environment, right? What is the environment for Darwin? Okay. So it's possible, and when Jonas talks about an inner instability, that's compensated, he implies that it's compensated by an outer stability in a certain sense. So it's almost like he's projecting at that point the view of the environment as something stable, that is guiding, or shaping, constraining the evolution of organisms. But the thing is, the instability is on both sides. And the instability that organisms have is their generative capacity to respond to the instability of the environment. So it'd be important to say that in the first instance, right? And we could get into a discussion of more contemporary theories of evolvability and all of that along those lines. But again, what is the environment? Okay, for Darwin, what is the environment? Darwin is very, very, very clear about this because he says it over and over and over again. The inorganic conditions of the environment, everything from like climate to any kind of, inorganic um, feature of the environment that you could separate from organisms, is very much the minor contributor in terms of selection, right? It's not that it's not a factor, but it's minimal in comparison to the selection exerted by organisms on one another. Okay, so in the first instance, if we're going to talk about the external influence of selection, and thus the relativizing of the, let's say, autonomy of the organism by the environment, it'd be really important just to emphasize that in Darwin's thought, that environment is mostly comprised of other organisms, and indeed, the strongest selection pressures are exerted on an organism by the members of its own species. Um, so, you can get here into a conception of things like enculturation and all sorts of stuff can grow out of this, and the way we might want to relativize our conception of individual humans as autonomous in the sense that they require other members of their own species to shape them and make them um, what they become. And then there are degrees of freedom that are discovered within that, but those degrees of freedom are themselves contingent upon a collective origin of the subject, really. That's not where we want to go here, but just to say that that kind of thought is already there in Darwin. The environment is not passive, the environment is not physics, the environment is mostly other organisms. So that's important. So the purposes of other organisms are what shape, in terms of selection, more strongly than anything else, the evolution of any given organism. So all the purpose here um, is not coming from some transcendent external designer, not even a, passively selecting physical environment, implacable or whatever. It's actually other organisms and their drives and their needs and their wants and all of that that is shaping the individual organism or the lineage of interest. Okay, so that's one thing that's really important to note, which I don't think Jonas mentions that at all. Um, that I think that already changes the picture quite significantly. But
Yeah, he certainly doesn't say that the environment is other organisms. I don't think he ever mentions that at all. But he does say nothing in nature is ever completely stable, and he's attributing agency, not passivity,
okay,
to the environment. And so,
implacable. He's saying that it's implacable, that it's blind, all of those sorts of things, right?
Mhm.
Um, and of course, someone like Richard Dawkins would talk about the blind watchmaker and all of that. People have been, and even Darwin would use this kind of metaphor as well.
Right.
Um, but it's only at the most collective and abstract level that you would think about the environment as blind in that sense. Because what's actually going on is organisms with desires and purposes and goals competing with each other and cooperating with each other. And that isn't something that Darwin neglects either. We can talk about matter of emphasis and his choice of terms, but one of the things that he talks about at great length is pollination. You know, um, he does talk about the way organisms enter into mutualist relationships and shape each other's evolution thereby. But there's a lot more to say about. So when Darwin would talk about laws of variation, right? Where does variation itself come from? He says some very interesting things, and he will continually emphasize our ignorance about the sources of variation. Although he will also, he's, you know, um, he presents an interpretive challenge because he will also say that when we speak of variation as just happening by chance, we're only there reflecting our ignorance. That's just something we say because we don't know where variation comes from. So he's also there not necessarily affirming the idea that like mutation or variation in general is itself a completely blind, purposeless process. He's saying that we often imagine that it is because we don't know. And there are a lot of details to discuss right there, but we'll bracket that for the minute.
Am I
Um,
wrong in remembering in Origin that I don't know if he explicitly cites Goethe and Goethe's study of morphology, but Darwin hypothesizes, I think, that a mutation in, say, one organ system of an
yeah,
organism may lead to changes in another organ system, and so that there's a proportionality in the way that the organism develops as a result of a mutation somewhere.
yes, exactly. So he mentions Goethe a number of times. He doesn't necessarily mention Goethe always when he talks about that, because he talks about exactly that, which is one thing I was also going to get to, many times. So a change in one part of an organism will stimulate compensatory changes in another. So he talks about internal organization of organisms, and this sort of change. And Darwin will talk a lot about structure. Um, but he also does talk in slightly different terms, but he talks about behavior quite a lot as well. So if we generalize across the things that he says, we could also say that a change in an organism's behavior could lead to compensatory changes in its structure. And in fact, he does say that pretty explicitly, because he says things like organisms have preferences. All right, so not just in sexual selection. Obviously, famously, he'll develop that quite a lot as a kind of theory of the emergence of aesthetics in nature. But he will talk about, I was saying this to you on WhatsApp, but he'll talk about like two wolves having individual prey preferences. And why do they have them? Well, here he will signal our ignorance. He will basically say, well, why do two humans like two different things? They're individuals. So Darwin is always bringing things back to the level of individual variation and building out from there. And he talks a lot about the arbitrariness, like it's very anti-essentialist, right? In the way that he treats species are not natural kinds. Different systematists, different taxonomists will disagree about whether this particular, thing should be variety should be considered a variety or a subspecies or a species. He considers it arbitrary at some level where those distinctions are made. But he'll bring a lot of things back to individual differences, and those include things like preferences. So one wolf likes to eat rabbits, another wolf likes to eat deer, whatever it is. And they could basically engage in a kind of cultural canalization of their populations, where eventually you've got one variety of wolf living in the steppes and one living in the plains or whatever, and they've separated that way on the basis of some individual whim. But we can flesh this out a little bit. Some wolf developed a strategy for catching rabbits really effectively, and so therefore it manifested a behavioral preference for feeding on rabbits because it was just really good at catching them. It can't be bothered. Like, it's so much work to get the pack together and hunt a deer. Let's just eat these rabbits. And that can actually drive a split in populations, the origins of varieties, and eventually the origins of species, right?
So this is a kind of Lamarckian or evolution acquired characteristics. So Darwin famously or infamously is leaving open the possibility of this kind of Lamarckian
Yeah, well,
process.
Darwin's totally Lamarckian in this sense, and Darwin even tries to propose a mechanism for the inheritance of acquired characteristics in his work on orchids and elsewhere, which is the inheritance of gemmules. Um, we got to remember that Darwin doesn't have a developed theory of genetics, right? So he doesn't make the distinction that will later be made between inheritance exclusively of modifications in the germline and the non-inheritance of modifications in the soma, right? So the non-inheritance of acquired characteristics. That's not on his radar, that distinction. Um, when he talks about the origins of variation, he doesn't say whether they are like generically, he doesn't distinguish between, germline origins of variation and origins of variation in the individual. He specifically talks about use and disuse as one of the laws of variation. Use it or lose it, evolutionary dynamics, as we would say today. And by the way, that can be both Lamarckian and natural selection as well. And this is the thing, like he doesn't see those as at odds. Um, I can just give vivid examples from my own work. So in snakes, we see this really fascinating dynamic, evolutionary dynamic, use it or lose it, where snakes like venom evolves a number of times in snakes. There are different ways of conceptualizing whether it evolves once or many times, but whatever. Um, but there are a number of certainly independent losses of the venom system in snake lineages, which had pretty highly developed venom systems, right, including like front-fanged snakes. So elapids, for example, cobras, kraits, mambas, all the major Australian venomous snakes are elapids, right? There are egg-eating sea snakes which are elapids. They eat fish eggs and they have funny little mouths and they pluck the fish eggs off the rocks very, very delicately. They eat defenseless prey, right? So these sea snakes have nubs instead of fangs. They have tiny little venom glands. And even at the level of the molecular evolution of the toxin encoding genes, they're full of nonsense mutations. They're full of mutations that massively reduce their potency. The system is atrophying, right, rapidly. You see the same thing with egg-eating elapids in Australia that are burrowing terrestrial species, right? So it's really fascinating with snakes because we know snakes will use their venom defensively, right? That's basically what happens when snakes bite people. Um, but it seems like the selection pressure on a defensive function for snakes, and spitting cobras might be an obvious exception, is not strong enough to maintain the venom system, to maintain the production, the ontogenetic production of the venom system in those species that cease using it for offensive purposes. So use it or lose it, right? And this was a very Lamarckian conception in Darwin's day. You know, the blacksmith's children have big muscles. Like Darwin literally says this, right? The blacksmith's children have big muscles because the blacksmith has been using those muscles. I mean, he uses that as a metaphorical example, but then he'll, of course, talk about like eye reduction in cave dwelling organisms and all sorts of much more tangible biological examples. And again, he's not separating the inheritance of acquired characteristics from the inheritance of mutations in the germline. That is not Darwin's thing. So there are a number of ways, in my opinion, in which Darwin makes it clear, and I think he just also takes it for granted on some level that the organism, the individual organism, is the pointy end. I mean, he doesn't just take it for granted, he says it, but he also takes it for granted that the individual organism is the pointy end of the evolutionary process. I mean, where does selection act anyway? Um,
Yeah. So it almost seems like Mendel and then, the further major advances in molecular biology and genetics in the mid 20th century were so exciting that they kind of distracted biologists from the other sources of agency in the living world for the better part of the last half century or so.
well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I spoke for a long time just then. There are a lot of points that you made, and there's a couple of things I still want to address, but you're absolutely right, and I think it is the physics envy dream of a precise reductionist science. So when like the physicist, Australian physicist Ernest Rutherford, he of the Rutherford Bohr atom, right? Big deal, big cheese physicist, says that, physics is science, everything else is stamp collecting or whatever, biologists take that kind of thing to heart, and they really want, I mean, I get it, they have a model of science and they don't see, maybe because they're not sufficiently philosophical, how biology, from its inception, from its 18th century inception, the modern science of biology, is eroding that image of science. Um, and one of my interests is the contribution of the emergence of biology as a science to modern thought. And I think I mean, I'm biased as well, right? But I think it's profound. Um, and I probably quoted, SFI President David Krakauer before saying that the development of complexity theory is the story of post-evolutionary physics, and going all the way back to Darwin's influence on Boltzmann and all of that. But I mean, the influence of the nascent science of embryology on Immanuel Kant is not small. And so the impact on modern philosophy, like the development of organicist philosophy in response to like modern organicism, notwithstanding that ancient organicism is a Platonic thing, as I know you would like to defend. And when we get into some criticisms of Platonism, we can go back and forth on that for sure. I agree with you anyway. But the modern organicism is very much, influenced directly by the emerging science of biology. But just a couple of things super, super quickly about this relativization of preformationism and so-called epigenesis, but the sort of preformationism of of an Aristotle, which you talked about, not necessarily global preformationism, but the preformation in an individual organism's, ontogenesis. Um, and you mentioned what can we salvage about preformation, and I think it's also just interesting to point out that these things get really political. Like when the dominance of Mendelianism and then like Weissmannianism, the Weissmanian interpretation of Mendelianism and all of that, that becomes a very live political issue in the first half of the 20th century, and the rise of Lukashenkoism in the Soviet Union. And there the irony is that Lukashenko sees the gene as a Platon as part of Platonic metaphysics. So he thinks that is a preformationist notion in and of itself. And
Yeah.
of course, we
Evan Thompson has the same criticism of Dawkins and Dennett as basically having a Platonic understanding of genetic information.
Yeah, no, I think that that's not wrong. I mean, again, it's complex, isn't it? What's Platonic and what isn't, and all of that. But yeah, um, that's something that we can salvage something of preformationism there, because the genome is a really, really big deal. Like genetic inheritance is really, really important for why organisms, look the way they are, mechanisms of speciation, evolvability, and all of that. It's not the only thing that's going on, but it's
Mm.
a really big deal. And so there's a lot of preformationism of forms. There is a lot of transmission of form. This is why the individual organism is open to formal cause with relation to the lineage, also open to formal cause with relation to the environment. But anyway, because form is inherited and but form is constraint. We're going to get into formal cause. I think we're going to have to get into that, because I think of the way when we get to Jonas's, in my opinion, mischaracterization of the mechanical philosophy itself, um, form is constraint on, we can say it's constraint on efficient cause, but
Mm.
it's that constraint function is inherited in a preformed way by each individual organism. That is the kind of bequest of the lineage, right? But it's not absolute, and that's the key issue here, because there's an immanentization of the forms themselves, because those forms are also products of the immanent process of evolution, and that's the real key here. That's the key to understanding the Darwinian, and it's not original to Darwin, obviously. It's an ancient thesis, but that's what he makes scientifically tractable just by piling a huge amount of empirical data on board of this, like descriptively, really. Um, this immanentization of the genesis of the forms, and this seems like something that Jonas is resistant to. Like he can't quite see how it's not just the placing of mind in nature that is the overcoming of Cartesianism. It's the immanent genesis of the forms themselves that is the overcoming of the whole of mechanical philosophy.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. Well, I
yeah,
mean, he does seem to me to be perfectly willing to let go of essentialism and the idea of Aristotelian substantial forms, and acknowledges the importance and says, the project now is evolutionary cosmology. How do we understand the place of mind in an evolving universe? And so I think he's fully on board with evolution. I think he's just worried about, again, the cultural impact of Darwinism, which he connects to Nietzsche and the confrontation with nihilism and nominalism and all of this, which is not something to just be put on, um, the shoulders of Darwin, like, oh, this is all his fault or something. In some sense, I think Jonas is both acknowledging the importance of what Darwin does for overcoming Cartesianism, but also pointing out the maybe cultural misappropriation of some of these ideas, because of the dominance of mechanistic materialism that sort of swallowed Darwin, um, and that was influential on Darwin in some respects, no doubt. Um, and so I think, yeah, I read Jonas as trying to really bridge between, like Aristotle, Kant, and Heidegger and Whitehead, and like undertake an act of, synthesis, and not just, refuting the ancient approach, the ancient forms of organicism, but showing how they can be evolutionized in a way. And he does want to offer a new account of form, but one thing I said in our WhatsApp about Aristotle is that we read his writing today, and I think it's very hard, not only because of the translation from ancient Greek, but because of the evolution of consciousness itself. He literally, I think, perceived the world in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a what's his name? This translator of Aristotle, Joe something or other, uh, who translates the term entelechy as like a form being at work, realizing or becoming itself. And so it's
Mm.
it's kind of it's very processual. There's a lot in Aristotle, despite being the origins of substance ontology, that's very dynamic, and very much about um, the unfolding is a preformationist idea initially, even though we use evolution in a different way now. But that these forms are dynamic, and they're in process, and I think Jonas is really trying to emphasize that and allow us to remember that Aristotle had a more participatory relationship to the phenomena he was studying. There's nothing like a Cartesian dualism between mind and matter for Plato, for Aristotle, even for the Greek atomists. It's a very different world picture, that doesn't sever interior and exterior in the way that we're used to in the modern world. And so I think his real target in both of these chapters that we read is Descartes. Not so much
Mm.
Darwin, but the Cartesian influence on Darwin and Darwinism and the way that Darwinism gets interpreted in a mechanistic way. Um, I wonder though if you could comment specifically on what Jonas says about how he reads Darwin's natural selection as substituting for teleology when he says that he says that this is essentially a negative substitute for teleology. It accounts for the disappearance only and not for the emergence of forms. It suppresses and does not create. Thus, it replaces teleology as a directing principle only on condition that it is offered the suitable material to select from. This
Yeah.
means that the positive role, the emergence of forms, falls wholly to the random play of aberrations from pattern, which as aberrations are by themselves indifferently freaks and on which the distinction between deformity and improvement is superimposed by entirely extraneous criteria, namely the differential selection of these mutations. Um, so do you disagree that there's no account in natural selection of the emergence of novel form, only of the elimination of forms that don't contribute to survival or reproduction?
Yeah. Yeah. Full stop. So it's easy to think there are branding issues here. There are terminological issues. If you were to consider natural selection, like, so there's this selectionist triad, right? I've
Mhm.
talked about it so many times. We've talked about it. We find it in Peirce, we find it in Lewontin, you find it in Erasmus Darwin, and it's very much there in Darwin, right? But he's not writing it out in the way that Peirce and Lewontin do, but variation, selection, inheritance, right? So is that natural selection, or is selection natural selection? Different people will give you a different view on that. But if you actually, if you want to talk about what is Darwin's thought, right? Darwin talks a great deal about variation. He talks a great deal about variation as prior to selection, as grist for the mill of selection. But he talks about sources that we just talked about it, sources of variation in even the habits and behaviors of individual organisms. But we can talk about sources of variation from a modern biological perspective if you would like as well. But I'm very, very hard line on this issue. Variation comes before selection, and this is of ontological significance because that is the Cora first ontology, right? Um, Cora comes first, and even more so than Plato in the view that I like, right? Everything else emerges from that, which is a difficult thought, and it needs to be thought rigorously and precisely, and not in terms of a fluffy processualism, or as we might find in some, vital materialisms and things are kind of just, it still ends up being miraculous. There's a lot of miraculous thinking in Jonas, I will say, but we want to avoid that as much as we can, and you know, sorry to you know, occasional listeners who think that this is an esoteric jerk-off fest because we reference other authors that, you know, are not the key subject. But of course, I would take us in a Simondonian or Deleuzian direction, which is much the same thing in this case. If we want to have what I think of as some of the most well-developed accounts of that Cora first ontology. Obviously, it's there in Peirce. Obviously, it's there in Whitehead as well. But I think, as you know, and we're not going to get into this, there are ways in which they slightly neuter it. That's just my view. Obviously, I know you and I have been over this heaps, and we will continue to, no doubt. But so this is super important. Variation is prior to selection in the negative sense, right? So if you take the whole triad, variation, selection, and inheritance, that is what is required for Darwin's principle or operation of natural selection. There has to be grist for the mill of selection, which is the imminent origin of variations to work on. But those variations are not fully formed, right? Those are not forms per se. Um, they will be informed via selection. Selection, actually, in the Simondonian scheme, okay, this is going to get more and more esoteric, but you know, Simondon has his triad, which is form, information, and potential, and he eventually looks to excise form in a particular way, right? But information is communication. That is the impinging of the exterior, or it can be internal as well, but that's the way that the action of what is encountered informs the individuation for Simondon of the system, right? So selection and information are deeply related in this kind of conception. Um, but
Mm.
so what happens in a very schematic sense is that you have essentially undirected variation, although there's also directed variation, as we discussed. There's use and disuse, there's, you know, preference, all of these kinds of things. But these things will, in nature, these are not, even those are not natural kinds, right? Undirected and directed variation are always, you know, bound up together in you know, complex ways, which is one of the reasons what makes all of this hard to think. It's hard to think constructively, and I think Jonas demonstrates for us how hard it is to think that way, because you can say that variation is creative. You know, variation is indeed the correlate of Whitehead's principle of creativity, but selection is constructive, right? So selection is putting those variations into a kind of order, if you want, which is where the full, you know, the forms which will then be inherited are being stabilized and like, you know, refined and formed basically.
Mm.
So I don't think it's right to think of selection as just negative in a way that is kind of dismissive, because you always have to think about the interrelationship between irrepressible variation and selection, and then remembering that in Darwin's thought, this variation is, and indeed because of the fact that he's not an ontologist, and because of the fact that to the extent that he mentions physics, he's like timeless law, you know, Newtonian timeless laws of gravity, blah blah blah, right? So he's essentially a prefirmationist in that sense. Um, when he's thinking about all this variation, it is an imminent organic biological process. So creativity is biological, is organic, is a property of life in this Darwinian scheme. And perhaps a problem with it's not exactly what Jonas is saying, but maybe it's part of a subtext, is that, you know, this creativity is not actually conscious, you know, it's not directed necessarily in the sense that, you know, the design, well, you know, some conscious organism is saying, I need this kind of thing in order to deal with this sort of thing, so I'm going to bring that variation into existence. No,
Mhm.
um, selection, which includes the preferences of the organism, um, as we've discussed, is always operating in what is made available to it. It's very existentialist, actually. So, you know, in a sort of Sartrean, you know, existence preceding essence way, which is also Lucretius. You know, when Lucretius gives his sort of incipient account of evolution, in whatever second century or whenever he's writing, he will talk about the fact that the potential of things is engendered by their being, right? So the fact that something exists is why it can be deployed in some particular way, essentially, right? Existence preceding essence. Um, So
Hmm.
I think it's just a shallow reading. It's like you can look at selection as winnowing, but it's a shallow reading to sort of dismiss the principle of natural selection in that way, because it always involves this particularly variable characteristic of organisms, the particular way that organisms vary. And again, we can get into a discussion of evolvability and the importance of the capacity to accumulate variations in the story of the complexification of organisms over evolutionary time. And like a peculiar, like the brain, you could say, neuroplasticity is a peculiarly evolvable organ in a certain sense, right?
Hmm.
Um, there's a lot
So
of, again, there's a lot of connections to make, but yeah, I think that that's a shallow reading is what I would say. Yeah, a superficial reading.
do you think that there's another principle at play aside from natural selection in the strict sense that would account for some of the emergence of novel form? So, for example, the first mycel or bilipid membrane that takes a spherical shape is just a
Um,
function of like order for free and physical forces and constraints, absolutely essential for the first cells that can just spontaneously emerge when you have
yeah,
lipids. But similarly, in a more impressive sense, something like the phi ratio that we find throughout nature is as a function of just the growth of multicellular organisms and the geometrical packing relationships that are there just by virtue of, being a physical system. That doesn't need to be, it is selected for in on some secondary sense, but initially it's just
yeah,
there, right? And I think there are examples of this that, more structuralist biologists would like Brian Greene, How the Leopard Changed Its Spots, wonderful book. There are
mhm,
mathematical reasons
yeah,
for certain biological forms that,
yeah,
again, secondarily get selected for, but initially there might be some elements of the body plans of different sorts of organisms that are not just arbitrarily um, formed as a result of this sort of natural selection process, but kind of doesn't mean that they're necessary. Maybe there are a whole sort of different branches of possible lines that these shapes could go down, but there are only so many branches. There are some shapes that aren't possible, right? So this is formal causation as constraint, right? And is this an additional factor to natural selection, or do you read it as just another example of natural selection, but at the physical and
yeah.
chemical level?
Well, look, it's a really, really important point that you made. And if you were taking natural selection to be Darwin's thought, let's say, then of course it's in addition to that, because he's not a speculative evolutionary cosmologist. But if you were thinking about a Persian or a Whiteheadian or a Simondonian generalization of evolutionary thought, which is not how Simondon would describe what he was doing, just by the way. But if you were thinking about it in that way, like if you were thinking about post-evolutionary physics, right, and the development of complexity science and the
Mhm.
effect of and the question is always going to be, and we had this discussion when we were talking about Mike Levin's Platonic space. I had this discussion with Mike and Robert Pretner on Mike's channel. The question is always going to be, how far can you push the evolutionary mode of reasoning, um, or the mode of reasoning that is oriented towards immanent genesis of forms. Because again, evolution can have its, evolution can be deterministic, but we're talking about generative constructive evolution here. How far can you push that mode of reasoning? And then at what point are you going to just declare the job done and say, oh, order for free? That's just physics. Well, a big part of the evolution, of modern science in the second half of the 20th century has been pushing evolutionary modes of reasoning further into physics. That's the development of complexity science. But of course, you can name drop people like Lee Smolin and whatever. And again, you can look at your Peirces and others who were, laws of physics. So form, these are themselves evolved. So if you were generalizing the principle of evolution in a diagrammatic sense of variation, selection, and inheritance, it's not an additional principle to invoke those physical constraints on form. And what for biology is order for free doesn't mean is not constructed evolved order from the cosmic perspective in that sense, right? But if you're talking about Darwin's thought, of course, it's additional to be saying that. Darwin wasn't thinking about that at all. But remember the way Peirce tautologizes um, natural selection. And again, there are felicitous tautologies, right? There are tautologies that ground the possibility of explanation without purporting to explain any particular phenomenon. This is that kind of thing. And Peirce says that which is good at persisting tends to persist. So there are stability criteria. There is a selection for stability, which is manifest in the kinds of forms that are mathematical or just physics that organisms end up adopting and kind of get for free. You're absolutely right to push back and to bring this up at exactly this point, given the way I characterized variation a moment ago. Um, but I, you know, am I a peculiar kind of evolutionary thinker? I am interested in this generalization in the same way that your heroes are, you know, Schelling, Peirce, Whitehead, etc., and there are very principled reasons to be interested in that. Am I saying ultimately I can or it can or whatever account for all the form? Well, no, certainly not in terms of any kind of complete explanation, because actually, to the view that takes variation as primary, the notion of complete explanation is anathema, and to the view, the epistemological view that arises from that, which is fallibilism, um, the notion of a complete explanation is in fact the neutering of all explanatory ambition, because as we've talked about, the big unexplained explainers always come in to enable the completion of an explanatory scheme. So there are a lot of complexities, obviously, in exactly the question that you've asked there. It really depends on what you mean by natural selection. I'm happy to say that it's additional, or it's beyond the scope of Darwin's conception of natural selection, but I would say that it still is potentially within the scope of a generalized selectionism. Um, and we see that kind of reasoning in physics a lot. Um, and it can be taken further than it has been. This is still the project of a constructive realism.
Mm.
So yeah, I think, well, yeah, I think all those things. One thing to say though, also when we go back to what Jonas was saying about the variation always being, like these organisms being freaks or being errors or being pathological in some way. It's just, I think, important there to note that that whole conception of variation as always error is based on a preformationist mode of reasoning. So you're assuming that there is a fixed norm in relation to which you can assess the pathological nature, or the because a lot of variation is actually felicitous, you know. Like we actually like novelty. We like some variation is selection will to some degree tell us which variations are errors or whatever. And of course, if you're thinking about like proofreading at the level of DNA, you can talk about errors and mutation in this sense. And there is an error theory of mutation, which was again popular with neo-Darwinians. And
Right.
there is this whole um, you know branch of physics, the calculus of variations, which is, cybernetic, because Wiener is a big part of the development of that, but also it's there in the free energy principle and all of that, that these are error minimizing processes. I would just say that that's a sloppy way of describing what a calculus of variations is really doing. These aren't actually optimization principles in the sense that there is some static standard against which you can optimize, because
Mm.
you better be full of error if you're going to respond to the error of the environment. Like you better
Yeah.
have resources to draw upon if you're going to be adaptable, basically.
And just to be fair to Jonas, he does put freaks and later pathological and monstrous in quotes. And I
Yeah,
wish he would cite the sources he's drawing on. It's clear that often he's attacking neo-Darwinism and more the reductionist mechanist forms of um, like Weissman and the gene-centric approach to this. But he doesn't really say, he does mention Weissman, but he doesn't really say what he's been reading.
yeah, yeah. You'll talk about Darwinian standards,
Yeah.
by Darwinian standards, too much to the bearer of life if adaptate, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's like, who are these? Where are you getting these standards from? Like,
Mhm.
it says even saying that the emergent forms are adaptations to conditions credits by Darwinian standards too much to the bearer of life if adaptation suggests a performance on its part. Well, I just gave you several examples of how Darwin talks about, like, this is very antithetical, and it's anathema to the kind of naturalist that Darwin was, to imagine that you would be taking all of the agency and the performative role of organisms themselves out of the picture. That's what Darwin is celebrating. He's really jazzed by organisms.
Right.
He's not trying to neuter them.
Sure.
Um,
But we see in someone like Richard Dawkins, brilliant as he is in his specialization,
yeah,
talking about organisms as lumbering robots that are
yeah,
just
yeah,
there for this, survival of their selfish genes. Um, and even if there are aspects of the science that Dawkins is engaged in that would mitigate against that conception, that's what gets popularized. And I feel like, Jonas is often speaking to that current of interpretation, again, of Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, and less so about Darwin as such. It would have been nice if he did a closer reading of Origin of Species,
yeah.
and engaged in that project of saving Darwin from the Darwinians, many of them at least.
Yeah, look, I do agree with a lot of things that Jonas says, but I think because of his apparent, again, I haven't even gone through this whole book, but in these chapters that we've read, because of his apparent failure to engage with certain aspects that I think are important, like if you're going to name drop somebody, read their work, like, because of his apparent failure to engage with the details of the principled arguments that certain people are making. And it's true that a lot of biologists don't read Darwin. I wouldn't say that about Dawkins or whatever, obviously, but it's true that they also make extrapolations from that thought, and they think that they're improving on it and all of that, which are actually buggering it in a way that would render it unrecognizable. Deleuze always says he wants to render the offspring, which are recognizable to the philosophers that he's engaging with, would render it unrecognizable. And again, they might think that that's a good thing. They're like, look, we know so much more than Darwin, and in many ways that's true. So like, for example, it's just wrong to think of, in my opinion, natural selection and the way Darwin talks about it as mechanistic at all. I don't think he's a thinker of mechanism. He's a thinker of principle. That's
Mm.
different,
Well,
or at
then
least,
Dawkins and Dan Dennett did great violence to Darwin by, Dennett famously describes natural selection as a mindless, purposeless, algorithmic process.
yeah.
And I know, we've had prior discussions about computationalism and ways that algorithmic processes can be read differently, but Dennett means what he says there, that, this can be reduced to a mechanism.
It's a real problem. Like, and we've talked a bit about Dawkins and Dennett offline, and I do want to even rescue these guys to some degree from themselves, because they do, in some aspects, have a very deep understanding of evolutionary thought, which is lacking in someone like Jonas, in my opinion. But in another aspect, they say a lot of really dumb stuff, and especially when they're waxing rhetorical, just like Jonas, when he gets, particularly rhetorical. I feel like he's at his, I mean, he's a good writer, but um, is he? I don't know. He writes a good sentence, but his arguments are not particularly well structured, I would say.
Mm,
But a lot of these guys, when they wax really rhetorical, and the problem for a Dawkins and a Dennett is that they are very much in that situation that Darwin himself was dragged into, but was not on his radar at all when he wrote on the Origin of Species. And he would say that he was a theist when he wrote that book. That religion versus science thing, and they've got to extirpate all of the last vestiges of religious thought. And the problem is that, as we've discussed, and let's get onto the mechanical philosophy as well, that ends up being an exercise more like in repression than anything. And so you end up just rendering unconscious a lot of the theological aspects of your own thought. And obviously Dawkins has frequently been caricatured and not inaccurately, but it's still a caricature in this way, that his zeal for atheism is exactly the kind of religious fervor that he is supposedly critiquing. So he turns atheism into a religion itself, but it's much deeper and more structural than that. You know, it's the actual logical principles, the operational principles that are taken over from the theological context in which a Descartes, a Newton, a Laplace were actually working in, and that remain deeply baked into the
Yeah.
mechanical philosophy that are the
Right.
real issue here, right?
So moving then to the is God a mathematician chapter, Jonas highlights the way that in its infancy, modern science was sort of sheltered by deism and by Cartesian dualism from having to really deal with this thorny issue that Darwin makes forces the confrontation with, which is that, and it's why, so much of the cultural movements of atheism use Darwin as their view Darwin as their champion. Like, oh, finally, now we don't need the God hypothesis at all anymore, and we have to confront the fact that we're just slightly more. Well, to even say more evolved doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as perfection in the post-Aristotelian Darwinian view of life. And so the confrontation with nihilism and the need to as Sean Carroll would say, well, we know that the life, the universe, and everything is totally meaningless, and so we have to make up our own meaning. And that nihilistic cultural condition, I don't think necessarily follows from Darwin, but it's where the culture went with it.
Yeah.
And there are some alternatives, like to try to view evolution as a meaningful process, but people like Dennett went out of their way to torpedo Teilhard de Chardin, for example. Um,
But I think, just to really quickly interject, I don't think Dennett, though, I don't think it's a fair characterization of Dennett to say that he wants to remove meaning from the world at all. Like he would contrast greedy reductionism and whatever like good sense reductionism or whatever he calls it, there. And he would say that these are all real. Like the problem with Dennett also is that he doesn't really do ontology, but he does actually provide a constructive view of a lot of things, which he's often, when he's caricatured and strawmanned, and he brings it on himself with a lot of the things that he says, I'm not just denying that, is elided from his view. Like, for example, I don't think it's a reasonable, précis of consciousness explained, bad title regardless, to say consciousness explained away. That's not what Dennett is doing at all. Dennett will give you very rich phenomenological descriptions all the time. He's not denying the existence of those things or their importance.
I mean, he's
Um,
famously quite critical of phenomenology. He prefers heterophenomenology, but I don't think he would really acknowledge
he's
phenomenology in any sense that a phenomenologist would.
Well, he's critical of phenomenology with a capital P. He also says that Douglas Hofstadter is the only genuine phenomenologist actually working, and he loves Douglas Hofstadter. So that with a small p, though, like someone who's really trying to explain. And I'm not affirming that view, okay? And I think that phenomenology with a big P has a lot to offer, obviously. I'm not affirming any of Dennett's views, really. I'm just saying that. Um, it is a little bit of a caricature. Like even in his, Quine Qualia essay, he give you very rich descriptions of what it is to taste wine. Dennett will talk about music. Very rich. Dennett was like a sensitive aesthetic dude.
Oh yeah,
He
I love reading Dennett. I just think to the extent that he has at least an implicit ontology, I just think he's
yeah
he's short-sighted. I won't say wrong. That's a little hubristic, but I just disagree with him at a very fundamental level. But I also
yeah
feel like he brilliantly, clearly articulates precisely that view, which I would say is more or less scientific materialism, whether greedy reductionism or not. Um,
yeah
and so
yeah.
he's the best foil for me to argue against that I've found really. So I love reading his books and responding to them because he so clearly states the position that I disagree with. Um, but
Yeah, no, I totally get that, and I have a fundamental disagreement with Dennett as well, which is just I think because of his in unwillingness to get into ontology, basically his unwillingness to question the hegemony of the mechanical philosophy, but basically of physics, and the received view of physics, he he misses the constructive ontology that would in fact complement a lot of the constructive aspects of his own thought. Like he's one of the best thinkers on free will, for example, you know, even though he has this compatibilist notion, which is kind of unnecessary in a sense, um, depending on what we mean by compatibilism. Anyway, that's not what we're getting into here, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, just this, I got sidetracked there too, but the way that the Cartesian dualism was like the nursery for modern science because it allowed it to not have to deal with the thornier problem of how what Descartes referred to as mind would relate to this realm of pure extension that can be measured and with the Cartesian coordinate plane, algebra geometry can be translated into algebra, and so these numerical relationships can thereby be more easily manipulated, calculated, and so on. And Janet and Darwin forcing the issue, I think, is one of the places where Jonas really does um, champion what Darwin brings about in some sense. Um,
I agree, although the way he frames it is that kind of despite itself, or it's an accidental, and that I just think is again kind of a mischaracterization.
yeah, how does he put it? What does he say? It happened that in the hour of the final triumph of materialism, the very instrument of it, evolution, quote unquote, implicitly transcended the terms of materialism and posed the ontological question anew when it had just seemed settled. And Darwinism, more than any other doctrine, responsible for the now dominant evolutionary vision of all reality, turns out to have been a thoroughly dialectical event.
Yeah, and I think the implication there is that, despite itself, right?
Mhm.
Darwin isn't a materialist, so and not at the time of On the Origin of Species in particular. So it's not that's not a reasonable characterization of Darwin. Of course,
Darwin's not a materialist.
Darwin's not a materialist;
What is he?
he's a theist. At the time, I mean, by according to him, when he wrote,
Oh, when he wrote Origin. Okay. I mean, what would you say his mature view is as an elder?
I don't think. I think he moves in the materialist direction under the influence of people like Huxley and others.
Mhm.
Um, and I think he increasingly questions the role of God. So I think he becomes more and more agnostic. And of course, Huxley, is the origin of that term, agnosticism. Um, so I do think he moves in that direction, and I think he's pulled there by his friends who are more motivated to make those kinds of arguments. But even then, I don't have, comprehensive familiarity with the things he says either, but would it be reasonable to describe someone who doesn't engage ontology as a materialist even, like I don't know that he's defending a materialist ontology in the way that, someone like Dennett might be, or in the way, and materialism is such a vague word, you know. Um, we talked about Lushenko. The Soviets
Mm.
explicitly thought that
Yeah.
Darwin was anti-materialist and in favor of dialectical materialism, were rejecting his thought. Materialism does mean different things, and there are, of course, lots of people who have talked about the deep compatibility between evolutionary biology and dialectical materialism as well. Not least Engels, but you know like, is Deleuze a materialist? Well, he would call himself probably a materialist at some level, and many people would think he is. But I mean, what
Yeah.
is materialism if these people are all materialists anyway? Because Deleuze has, famously this robust conception of the virtual.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I like Dennett's account of this that, a materialist is one who thinks all form and structure, everything that exists is a result of cranes, not skyhooks. And he's characterizing formal and final causation as skyhooks in order to in order to dismiss it as silly supernaturalism. And so the
I think
materialist is the one that
the key,
everything's, yeah,
yeah, the
which,
key thing about a crane though is that it's constructed, but then it reaches
yeah.
down. So it's a construct. I mean, I'm not saying this is exactly what Dennett is saying, but cranes actually are an instantiation of like formal and final cause. I mean, not least as artifacts, right? Because they're built
Mhm.
with particular forms and purposes in mind. But they reach down such that it's like the order for free thing that you brought up. You know, once order has been constructed, it is available, and you don't have to reconstruct it every single time, right? So you
Yeah.
can, in a constructive realism, you can get a sense of the construction of the forms themselves. You just don't start with them because, again, that erodes the explanatory ambitions of any kind of philosophy. To put the form in at the beginning is
But
to say,
there are, yeah, but there are different ways of explaining form or wholeness, let's say.
hmm,
There's the method of division. So you start with the whole and you get the parts through division. And then there would be the method of addition, whereby you start with the parts and they add up to a quasi whole that doesn't
yeah,
really have any independence from the parts. It's just the sum, not greater than the sum. And I think that is it's a subtler way of getting at how we don't need to think in terms of, skyhooks or a Deus ex machina reaching in from some other dimension when we talk about wholeness. And certainly we don't want to end up with some kind of a closed whole as you get in, Aristotle's conception of the cosmos. But I think actually Plato offers us a different cosmogony. There's no cosmogony in Aristotle. There's no cosmogenesis.
yeah.
And this is a point that Jonas makes. Sorry if it's loud. They decided to power blast the sidewalk outside.
Well,
Can
good.
you
No,
hear
I
that?
can't.
Okay,
No,
good.
Zoom is very
Um, what's that?
Zoom is very good at filtering out those things. I mean, especially because you're using a microphone, I suppose. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I can still hear it and it's distracting. But anyways, Jonas makes this point about how Plato's account in the Timaeus of the genesis of the universe is very different from the biblical account in Genesis, where in Plato there are, well, first of all, subsidiary deities, and nature is ensouled, and for Plato, soul becomes this mediating term like life. Soul and life are kind of equivalent for these Greek thinkers. It mediates between uh, reason and necessity or contingency. Um, and what you lose in modern thought, and Jonas points out that this is really the unintended consequence of the monotheistic insistence on the complete and utter transcendence of God from the universe. You lose that mediating principle, that third term, um, and then end up with this mind matter dualism, just as in deism, you end up with all of the formal and final cause, if you want, granted to God as the first cause, and then the universe just unfolds according to that plan. And so this is why Jonas thinks that modern science, despite the important influence on mathematical physics from Plato and the Pythagoreans, is anti-Platonic in the sense that it has no more room for something like a world soul, which for Plato was his explanation for the self-movement, not only of living organisms, but of the cosmos as a itself a system. And also the soul for Plato is an explanation of the intelligible order of the world, right? It's what allows, he still has his demiurge and the forms, but it's what allows we creatures, well, he wouldn't use the term creature, but we as organisms to sort of uh, participate in the intelligibility of the world, the fact that we're ensouled and that it's ensouled and so on. And so, for him, for Jonas, modern science is anti-Platonic, not Platonic, even though I can see what you mean of course, when you point out the ways that mechanistic philosophy has a Platonic residue to it, right? So this is nuanced, but
yeah, yeah. I mean, so in one can always fall back on the whole footnotes quote, I suppose, but I don't think that that's all that helpful in this context. I mean, we can say yes, that of course it's Platonic because everything is. Um, but I do think that, and we talked about this obviously more last time because we were talking about Schelling's reading of the Timaeus. I don't think it's wrong to say that, the forms I agree with all of what you're saying, and I agree with the fact that if indeed the mechanical philosophy is Platonic in some sense, it is also anti-Platonic in other sense. It's a select reading of Platonism, or of Plato or whatever, like what's Platonic versus Platonistic or Platon, like it's all like what's Darwinian, what's Darwinist, all of this stuff, right? Um, it is in a similar way to neo-Darwinian thought has something in common with Darwin. And even social Darwinism has something in common with Darwin, even though Darwin, explicitly repudiated that kind of thing. And, we can talk about that at the end if you want. Um, the mechanical philosophy is anti-choric, um, and anti-organicist. So that Plato has the chora in his cosmogenic scheme. And this is the irony. This is where I think again Jonas gets it wrong, because Jonas the and I don't have all the textual references to give right now, but the kind of picture that Jonas gives in both of these essays of the mechanical philosophy's view of the cosmos is almost as if it was a Cora only view, whereas that's the opposite of the truth. Even though he does get some of the theological stuff correct at the same time, there's this, I don't feel like he's consistent even in his own presentation here, but he's giving this, the somehow the product would have to be more than the cause, and and there's no formal cause. I'm going to get to that in just a second. In the mechanical philosophy, it's a world of pure efficient causation, which is the exact opposite of the reality of the mechanical philosophy, even though that is the received view. People say that all the time. It's wrong, and I'll get to that in just a sec. Um, Obviously, that's Aristotle anyway, not Plato, but I do think it's still justifiable to say that a view in which there are timeless forms and a demiurge that are transcendent, that come in from outside the immanent process of genesis and creativity, which is represented by the Cora, and impose something on it. So it's hylomorphic in this sense, even though again that's Aristotle. Um, it is justifiable to refer to that as Platonic. It's justifiable to say that Plato's conception is dualist, even though there's the triadic thing that you've just mentioned as well. That arises because Plato is very good at criticizing himself, and that arises as a critique of the dualist conception that Plato has in fact installed to some degree, or has developed. And that's further explored in the Parmenides as well, which we should do sometime, right? Like the notion of the one itself is there to solve this problem of participation. Like, I like the participatory turn, as I know you do, but at the same time, that language of participation is itself part of the problem, because creatures don't have to participate in forms in the sense that everything is, if everything is immanent, right? You have the language of participation partly because the forms are coming in from somewhere else. So there's a lot of, we've been doing a bit of Plato recently, and we'll keep doing it, and I think it's very, very fertile. But so I think the mechanical philosophy is both Platonic, well, both anti-Platonic and hyper-Platonic, depending on what we mean by Platonic, obviously. I mean, and that's a vacuous thing to say completely. But if you think Platonism is a formalism, and I mean that in the sense of a form first or a timeless form kind of conception, where the forms are coming in from outside and imposing order on, the whatever, the passive matter. And of course, as we discussed, we read it directly, the quotes. That notion of matter as completely passive and characterless is very much there in the Timaeus. That is not just an Aristotelian thing. And indeed, when you were talking about Aristotle earlier and the way that we mischaracterize him, I wanted to bring up, Hule itself and our potential mischaracterization of Aristotle's notion of matter as a passive characterless principle. If it's correct, and there's that Dennis Polis essay, and I think Jack Bagby was saying on your last chat about, if it's correct that we've misread Aristotle's Hule, and it is in fact a much more generative and dynamic active principle, that throws back on Plato the conception of matter as characterless, and it needs to be characterless because it has to take the imprint of the forms in a way that, but again, there's tension there because also there's this function of necessity of the Cora of matter itself, and that seems to somehow perturb its, seems to give it a character and to perturb its capacity to take the forms in a so Plato's full of problems, right?
Mhm.
um
Right.
but, but the mechanical philosophy, to say this really, really quickly, if you take the Laplacian paradigm in physics as the quintus, like the apotheosis of the mechanical philosophy, which I think would be a reasonable thing to do, and I think, that's implicit. Well, he mentions Laplace a number of times, in Jonas's characterization in both of these essays. And if you take Laplace's demon as a, not what he called it, but if you take that thought experiment as a distillation of the Laplacian paradigm, which again I think is a justifiable way of thinking about things, we could talk about it in more technical detail if we want. Um, there's also a thing, I think it was in the Darwin essay where Jonas gets precisely wrong the Laplacian Markovian aspect of the mechanical philosophy, because he says something about, because there's no intrinsic telos, it's impossible to say what's going to happen next. And it's like, no, because there's an externally imposed telos, it's possible to say exactly what's going to happen next.
Hmm.
And that's the Markovian and Laplacian paradigm in contemporary, in modern physics. We can talk about that detail as well. I'm wary because I'm all over the place here. But when people say, this is the thing I want to drill down on really quickly, when people say that the mechanical philosophy and the Laplacian paradigm, as the apotheosis of that, renders an image of a world of pure, efficient causation, that's precisely incorrect and imprecise in a very important sense. And this is the sense in which the Laplacian paradigm is Platonic in being formalist. What Laplace is saying with the Laplace's demon exercise, and indeed the way things still work in the Laplacian paradigm in physics, is that give me the forms and I will show you a world of pure efficient causation. It is only by virtue of the absolute static nature of preformation, of formal logic, of the tyranny, not of efficient causation, but the tyranny of formal causation in the mechanical philosophy, that Laplace can then say that the cosmos is computable. So the cosmos is only computable because it is completely canalized. It is form that canalizes it. Give me entailing laws, that's form, and initial conditions, but initial is also a misnomer here because they're just boundary conditions in the sense that, in this view, any time slice can function as the initial conditions. But CF the past hypothesis in contemporary cosmology. Um, give me the forms, give me their timelessness, give me their preformation, and then I can give you a computable cosmos. You can only have a world of pure efficient causation because formal causation is absolute. That's a
Hmm.
really important thing, and it's important, in my opinion, to get that critique right if you want to move beyond the mechanical philosophy.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I appreciate that nuance about Laplace's view and what's going on there with the mechanical philosophy. Um, I wanna go back to the question of participation for a second, because I agree with you about the way that what we could call, and actually Jacob Sherman in that book, The Participatory Turn that you briefly referenced, has a chapter called A Genealogy of Participation, where he shows, as a result of an evolution of consciousness, actually three distinct modes of participation, beginning with Plato's formalist understanding of it, where, as Jonas points out, there's a sense still in Plato that the effects are less than the cause. So the ideas are the cause, the physical instantiations are the effects, and are pale imitations of the original. And so that's a kind of formal participation that the image or the copy gains whatever being it does have in some diminished form from the fullness of being in the form. And I think that, yeah, that's not the form of participation that I would want to salvage. Um, there's another form that comes out in Thomas Aquinas, which Jake, I think it's existential participation, that, um, God is being, and all other beings gain their existence from participation in that being. And then in the Romantic period, there's a further mutation of this idea, almost an inversion actually, of participation that the Romantics bring about. Schelling plays a big role in this. There'd be more a creative or expressivist form of participation where now um, human beings and all organisms have a co-creative role to play in um, in shaping possibilities and shaping the forms or what Whitehead would call eternal objects, so that now it's not just a one way sort of raying out of the form from a Platonic heaven, but instead there's a kind of call and response going on between actuality and possibility, which is that's the kind of participation that I would want to affirm. And so, there's an evolution, as it were, of the idea of participation that we should keep in mind there.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I agree, and I would want to affirm a particular version of that as well.
hmm,
No, I will say, the the back and forth is still all imminent in a certain sense, right? It doesn't have to be, a back and forth between, forms which are outside of
mhm.
and
Yeah.
indeed, or it's weakened that conception already by saying that they are imminently transformed in some sense
Hmm.
for effectuationist, a counter effectuation thesis, or
Right. And I think, one area where, you and I have this playful tension is, I think one way of expressing it is that transcendence isn't necessarily a bad word for me. I mean, there are forms of transcendence, for example, the deist picture that I do reject, and a strict monotheism, which even Jonas, as a Jewish philosopher, points out that Christian monotheism, Christians who are really emphasizing the utter complete transcendence of God seem to have forgotten about incarnation and the Trinity, this more relational aspect of the divine. It's interesting, to have a Jew remind Christians of that. Um, but there are other forms of transcendence which would be of the phenomenological sort that I think Jonas and even Heidegger are so good on, where, to understand the relationship between freedom and necessity, or between, if we do want to bring subjectivity and objectivity or mind and matter back together, there's a sense in which, and the way Jonas describes this, there's a horizon of concern which opens up in the within the experience of the organism. And this isn't a spatial interior. He's not talking about, somewhere in the brain this horizon of concern is being met. No, it's intimately interrelated with and inseparable from what appears to our physical senses as this extended body. But in some sense, whatever mind is, whatever subjectivity is, it is transcendent to the uh, the extended physical form of the body. There's a way in which, while not wanting to refer to another dimension that is separate from um, the lived body, there is still, I think, some meaning that we can gain, a renewed meaning to the notion of transcendence that prevents us from ever imagining we're going to find or explain mind by reference to activity of neurons, for
yeah.
example.
Well, no, I think that that's important, and I don't. Transcendence isn't really a bad word for me. I'm not one of these people who necessarily. I mean, I might be in a particular moment and
Hmm.
rhetorically wants to dustbin a certain word. I was talking to a good friend and a sort of Simondonian Aristotelian philosopher yesterday, and he was talking about how we need to get rid of the word nature, and
That'd be hard.
because because I mean he was presenting a nuanced picture obviously, but he means nature in the essentialist sense, right? Because the Darwinian and extended picture, the process relational essentially, or the constructivist picture of nature, and not social constructivism, constructive realism, is a deconstruction of the classical image of nature with a capital N. We just need to give that word to the essentialists, and then we can move on more easily. And I'm like, yeah, but I want naturalism, and I also don't want naturalism to be a metaphysical thesis by default,
And
like.
etymologically, natura, and but going back to physis, means nativity. It means birth. It's a such a rich concept that.
I'm yeah, I'm more of the exactly of the let's reclaim this word.
Mhm.
Um, it's because it just, and also that particular word just means too much for me because nature's just so important to me.
Yeah. But I
That,
just see this tendency among some delusians, or those who would want to affirm no pure immanence. And I'm like,
yeah.
well, purity itself is part of the problematic kind of transcendence that we do want to get rid of. And so I'm more of a thinker of the between, and
Yeah.
that's what metaxi, the Greek for participation, is really all about for me. It's about staying in between, holding the tension between these extremes, never trying to we end up explaining away when we rush to one extreme or the other in the attempt to eliminate the pull. And we're always caught in between these tendencies of thought, which if you break the tension, you run off into a kind of greedy reductionism, which it can be reduction to the parts or reduction to the whole, either way.
Undermining or
Greedy.
overmining or
Yeah.
duomining. Yeah, Graham Harman. Um, yeah, so Deleuze will actually use the term, but
Mhm.
Jung will use the term as well, the immanent transcendent or
Mhm.
transcendence in immanence. And that would describe the kind of dynamic that you're talking about. And then I think we can also make that general, we can diagram that. And it's not just about, an experience that we have. I mean, obviously, mind and its relation to nature or to the physical, let's say, is an important aspect of this, but it's really about exceeding a reference frame of any kind. Like it's about being in excess of a particular kind of formal constraint. And so then we can bring this back into the Darwinian context and talk about variation, excessive variation. Um, and this would be, and we can speak in very different registers about this. When we talked about Answer to Job, I talked about the excess of the pre-individual in the Simondonian sense that is maintained by the individual. The individual is in a sense immersed in it, but maintains it, has an annexed relationship with it, and it's the indwelling of the paraclete in the way that Jung presents it. Um, that is our capacity for transcendence, our capacity to find degrees of freedom, and why we are not in the kind of relational lockstep that, because I referenced Graham Harman worries about with relational philosophies and worries about with Whitehead, but which in fact is formally instantiated in, say, Bohmian mechanics, the Bohmian lockstep, where relation is real, but it is all pervasive and thus all constraining. And no, we can transcend context. But we can give all sorts of accounts of that, even without referencing mind and physics and or whatever, however we're supposed to figure that duality. But that's obviously a big part of it. And of course, I use the term transcendence in those contexts. And if I'm speaking about, a transcendent experience that I had listening to music or in nature or meditating or with, certain exochemical substances aiding me or whatever, um, yeah, I would use that term in those ways. But in a strictly metaphysical context, I might push back on it. And I might say it needs to be problematized in a particular way because it can have these pernicious connotations. Um,
Mm. Right. Right. Um, so should we talk about metabolism and
can do,
Jonas's
yeah.
attempt to, I think, recuperate a form of formal causation by pointing to the way that organisms make themselves, which is his way of distinguishing organisms from machines. And he makes this other interesting distinction between phenomenal individuals and ontological individuals, where a phenomenal individual would be something that our sensory perception fuses together, but it's in and of itself just a kind of aggregate, whereas organisms fuse themselves in a sense, and give rise to this horizon of concern and exist for their own sake, as individuals rather than just having their individuality derived from by way of some kind of phenomenal projection on our part. And you've been mentioning Simondon a lot, and I was thinking of his account of technical objects uh, as they evolve, in a sense, become more individuated. And I think Simondon still has this distinction between a living organism and a machine, but he's pointing out the ways that machines, like an engine, it begins as this collection of parts that need to be assembled when you buy a car and you have to, put all these pieces together. Whereas nowadays you buy a car and all the things that the engine needs to run successfully are compactly, contained, and it seems to have it has its oil, has its water, radiator, everything's there. Obviously, it needs internal inputs and sort of living organisms, but there's a movement towards greater individuation, even though at least a difference in, I don't know if it's maybe a difference in degree for Simondon between a technical object and living organisms, though organisms are also technical in a sense. And so the metabolism seems to be that one distinction where, engines are made of parts that don't make themselves. Organisms are made of parts that do make themselves. It could be that we're, as Mike Levin's always saying, we're on the verge of, truly autopoietic machines, perhaps
Yeah.
either that's already been achieved to some minimal sense or will be soon. And so is there, do you think, a huge gap here between what Jonas is arguing about metabolism and what Simondon is doing with his emphasis on technicity, or are they mostly in agreement here?
Well, I probably am going to say that they're mostly in agreement by short. I mean, the Simondon account of technical objects is complex and has some tensions with itself. So he would say that a technical object uh, and kind of technical knowledge, the relationship between technical knowledge and technical object is an interesting one because there's a technical essence that is allied with or tied to the ultimate raison d'etre of the technical object. And but when the technical object is originally built, perhaps the inventor doesn't even really have a clear understanding of the technical essence, um, some sort of relatively dim understanding of it. But regardless of how clear their understanding of it is, they can't actually manifest that in one fell swoop, So the thing is experimental in the sense, or it's, selection based. Um, the thing has to enter into the world in a certain form, and then it will undergo this sequence of concretization, he would say, and it would become more like, as you were saying, a a uh, a living or natural object, although of course it is not a natural object, but it is understandable in terms of a certain kind of biologic, so it has a kind of evolutionary impetus to it, which is in some sense autonomous, um,
Hmm.
because, I mean,
So it
I'm
achieves a kind of partial individuation as
yeah,
it.
it's because it's part of life, like it's because it's internal to life that it partakes of this biologic, and because it has a reason for being, um, and it is, it's gonna. So he gets a little bit progressivist, and it's not that Darwin doesn't have that, as we know. And if we were going to talk about social Darwinism, we would have to grapple with that. But Simondon gets a little bit like that, like it will progress towards a certain kind of perfection, in relation to the technical essence, that it has, which is again its reason for being. And part of that would be the synergizing of the functions of certain parts, and it's the fact that it moves, is exactly as you were saying, from a situation of being like parts extra parts into something that is way more integrated. But it also is challenging with Simondon because he would not see our contemporary, he would not see like a Tesla, I don't think, actually I know he wouldn't, as concretized in the sense that we're talking about, because he's very concerned about another dynamic in technical evolution, which is the loss of the technical schema, the loss of technical knowledge in society, which is predicated on the kind of schema which is transmittable amongst people and enables them to actually work, like not just to be users, but to actually work on that concretization of their own technical objects directly, right? So in a certain sense, he would say like an old school tractor where a farmer has to do all of the, like some diesel tractor has to do all of this maintenance and all of that himself, that in a sense there's still this living relationship. The farmer isn't just a user, he's also maintaining and potentially even improving the object in this directly relational way. Whereas a car, on the one hand, it seems more concretized when all of the parts are kind of like hybridized and put together, but there's no way that the user can get in on that. Like it's become alienated, in fact. And so Simondon talks a lot about the alienation of the technical object and the alienation of the user or the worker. So he has a kind of Marxist aspect here, where there's a critique of the worker's alienation from the implements in the factory, from the machines that they are mere users of, but don't know how to fix themselves and are essentially alienated from. And part of it, where Simondon gets really weird, is, but not wrong, but weird, is that the technical object itself contains an alienated chunk of humanity, right? So it doesn't have an independent, again, it's not like a natural object. It doesn't have an independent existence from the human inventors and designers and workers and like people involved with it. In fact, the technical essence comes from the inventors and is put into the technical object like a piece of their soul or something. It's the form, like the form comes from the inventor. And it's just like, maybe I've said this on our conversations before. I don't know. I was saying this to someone else recently, but it's like if you were listening to a musician, you're listening to Coltrane improvising a saxophone, and you like getting really, really involved in it, and you start to feel like this incredibly resonant thing. And Whitehead would talk about this kind of stuff, right? It's like you're mind melding. You're sharing. You imagine at least that you're having the kind of experience that Coltrane was having when he was playing that you're directly merging. Even Hofstadter would talk about this, the union of souls in the shared enjoyment of music. Even as listeners, he would talk about that. This piece of the soul, the creative formal aspect of the technical object, becomes alien. It's a piece of humanity, and it becomes alienated when it's not in a kind of living relationship with the people who are using it. So it gets all funky. So there are ways that you might think of a contemporary car as more concretized, but also ways in which it's less concretized. And so it becomes, I don't know, I'm no Simondon scholar. So it
Mm.
becomes difficult to tease those parts. That's something I'm sort of trying to get my head around fully. Like I think there are tensions in Simondon's thought as well. Like I don't think he's fully in agreement with himself. But because you mentioned Simondon and I went into that, I'm now completely sidetracked from where else we were going. Oh, would he agree with Jonas? I think one of Jonas's strongest places um, is this description of metabolism, is this distinction between the living organism and a technical object or a machine, and the way that the only thing, not quite the only thing, he has an appendix about this, right? That he talks about the non-participation of DNA in metabolism, which is actually incorrect, but partly
Mm.
correct.
Mm.
And it's not entirely his fault, but if he knew about epigenetics and all of that, in fact, it would go some way to repairing his relationship with Darwinism too, which is quite interesting.
Right.
But there are neural cells that live for, but again, I don't have all of the notes, as clear as I'd like, because one of the mistakes that I feel like Jonas does make. So I think he says a lot of really beautiful things about metabolism, and that he's right about that in many ways. But he also identifies individuality at the level, say, of the individual cell in this appendix. He talks about the neural cells that last for a lifetime, or most of a lifetime, after all of the, crazy pruning and stuff that goes on in early childhood and everything. But the individual actually doesn't really exist at that level. Those individuals are very much subsumed in collectives. And in fact, what's very dynamic still is the connection that those cells have. So neuroplasticity is not necessarily about having, even though in some cases there is, actual genesis of new neural tissue, new nerve cells, but it's more about the connections that are forming. And he doesn't have that kind of connectionist. Again, not entirely his fault. Like both things that he says in the non-participation of certain aspects of the organism in metabolism are wrong technically, and it would sort of strengthen his view almost if he did if he knew a bit more, which is not his fault. But I feel like there's a way that he falls back on a certain kind of essentialist notion of the individual when he talks about these, cells that don't participate in metabolism, and even the way that DNA doesn't participate, he feels, in metabolism, where he's not able to think that constructionist bridge in a certain sense. And that's part of the issue that I have with his thought altogether. Like he doesn't see the the relativization of autonomy and individuality, that is a big part of the key to that sort of constructive way of thinking.
Right. Yeah. Now I want to touch on that point, and then maybe that will be a bridge to some of the ethical concerns that Jonas has, and some of the history here. But when he talks about metabolism, he's referring to the form of an organism there as being its wholeness, which is distinct from the matter which flows through it. And metabolic activity is this way of maintaining that wholeness as the matter and energy flows through. And he points to, and he thinks this is unique to the living world and separates life from non-life, from physics. But interestingly, he this is one of the reasons I think he must have been reading Science in the Modern World while writing this book. I mean, I know he was. He points to the account of energy and electromagnetism as waves, and that waves are an example, he thinks, in physics of this kind of wholeness. And Whitehead in Science in the Modern World explicitly links this account of energy to the idea of organism, in the sense that it takes a quantum of energy, a photon, say, a certain amount of time to manifest as itself. And so um, this, I think, is an interesting point where Jonas starts to move a little bit in Whitehead's direction, even though in one of the appendices he really does come down against Whitehead's view that physics can be organicized, um, in this sense. And so he wants to give an account of form and wholeness as a biological phenomenon, whereby he says organic form rides its changing matter like the crest of a wave. And he
Mm.
develops this idea, this dialectical idea of needful freedom, that the form of an organism is in a dialectical relationship to matter that he describes in terms of needful freedom and precarity. And this is another source of his criticism of Whitehead for not having allegedly any place for death. Um, he doesn't think it's appropriate for Whitehead to attribute a kind of conatos, or striving to like physical particles, um,
In,
that
inwardness, yeah, he says.
inwardness, yeah, that hydrogen has no sense of precarity or threat or fear of not existing anymore, which, fair enough. It could be that fear is a higher grade emotion that only comes online when you have biological forms of organization, but it doesn't mean there isn't another kind of inwardness um, prior to that. Um, but there's this quote that you pulled out that I want to
Mm.
share that I think interestingly speaks very much to Jonas's own biography and in world historical context, as a Jew who grew up in Germany, um, somewhat, he thought, integrated into German culture, but also always an outsider, which obviously became quite amplified in the 30s and 40s with the rise of Nazism. But I think there's a sense in which um, this account, which I'll read in a second, of the nature of life, is subtly reflecting his experience as a Jew living in Europe. Um, so he wrote, profound singleness and heterogeneousness within a universe of homogeneously interrelated existence mark the selfhood of an organism. An identity from moment to moment reasserts itself, achieves itself, and defies the equalizing forces of physical sameness all around, is truly pitted against the rest of things. In the hazardous polarization thus ventured upon by emerging life, that which is not itself and borders on the realm of internal identity from without assumes at once the character of absolute otherness. The challenge of selfhood qualifies all this beyond the boundaries of the organism as foreign and somehow opposite, as world, in which, by which, and against which It is committed to maintain itself. Without this universal counterpart of otherness, there would be no self. And in this polarity of self and world, of internal and external, complementing that of form and matter, the basic situation of freedom with all its daring and distress is potentially complete. So, a few changes of words there, and you could just as easily be describing, the experience of a Jew in Europe, I think.
Mm.
Um, and so I think as you were, suggesting a way in which the ethical urgency that Jonas is coming to this project from is he's living in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and he's also taking on board his teacher Heidegger's critique of technology, um, and in framing, and realizing the failure of Heidegger at this most decisive moment in the 20th century, perhaps in human history, where he was unable to avoid the social and political pressure of this rising tide of fascism in his country and just fully goes along with it. And Jonas thinks this is a failure not just of Heidegger as an individual, but of philosophy as such to not be able to meet that moment with more ethical resolve. And he thinks that it points to the ethical vacuousness of Heidegger's philosophy. And just, another anecdote here in the early 60s, Drew University held a conference, their religious studies department, I think. The theologians wanted to show how valuable Heidegger's thought could be for a new kind of existential Christian theology. Heidegger was going to come and he canceled at the last minute. So they're like, oh, this student of his, Hans Jonas, is already here in the US. Let's invite him instead. He can speak to Heidegger's philosophy and show, the positive potential for theology. And Jonas comes in and completely trashes Heidegger, for the reasons I just articulated, that there is no ethics in Heidegger, and you should keep it as far away from your Christian theology as possible. And so I think this ethical urgency is well placed, and yet leads to some over some exaggerated critiques of what Jonas thinks he's up against. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how relevant this point is, but I just think it's interesting to note that in the 20s and 30s, Jonas was a Zionist, and he goes to Palestine, run by the British at the time, and wants to establish state of Israel, and then comes back to fight in the war with the British against the Nazis. Then goes back to Israel to fight in the war in 48 and 49 that establishes the state of Israel, and pushes Palestinians off their land. And there's a way in which what at the time felt like a morally justifiable stance and movement, namely Zionism, as a matter of survival for the Jewish people, um, nowadays looks very different, in the way that this movement to preserve Judaism from attempted extermination on the part of the Nazis ends up in many ways recapitulating that same um, impulse against a perceived other and foreigner. So I think all told, the point here is that it's impossible when reading Jonas to separate the facts of biological evolution and the science of biology from the deeper um, values and morality that have shaped the modern world's appropriation of Darwinism, right? And so I think a lot of this there's a way in which fact and value can get confused, um, where our attempt to properly account for the facts and theorize about the facts is overburdened by a certain kind of moralizing. But at the same time, it's, I think, uh, impossible to, I mean, one of the things evolution forces us to do is overcome the fact value division, ontologically speaking. Um, you know, the science is not value neutral, right? Even though we want to be um, as neutral as we can in describing the facts and pursuing truth free of any moralizing. But still, at the end of the day, I think Jonas's work just speaks to, and he contributes majorly to bioethics, to the Green movement in Germany. He was extremely influential on the rise of that political party, and all German political parties were reading his work on bioethics as a source of inspiration for a more environmental approach to certain questions. And so, yeah, I didn't necessarily want to get into all the history, but I felt like it was important to share that because, again, his account of life as being, you know, something profoundly single and in heterogeneous opposition to this homogeneous environment he's describing, it very much seems to me to be stemming from his own
Yeah.
experience and his own biography. So I don't
And
know
it
if
does,
anything comes to mind when I share all that, but
oh, I mean, too much, and all of the little nitpicky things that I want to say about. I have hundreds and hundreds of annotations in these chapters, right? So all the things we're not going to get to say, but no, I think that that's all so important to say. And it on the one hand, we can read it as an affirmation of Jonas's importance as an ethical philosopher, as a moral philosopher, a courageous person, um, and he's an important thinker. But because he's important, and even because some of his criticisms of the scientific paradigm hit home, that is a reason for us to be all the more critical of all the stuff that he gets wrong, which is a lot.
mm,
Um, and that then might need us, lead us to bring in, as you have, and we have a couple of times, the moral, ethical motivations which kind of override, the work. Because really, these two chapters in particular, and not exclusively, are presented as works of philosophy of science, and they are referenced in certain kind of
mm.
philosophy of
They're
science
not
texts.
presented that way by Jonas, but they are by others. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are in many ways by Jonas, to be honest. I don't, if taken in isolation, I think not, again, not exclusively. That's not his only desideratum, obviously, but um, and again, I do think there are important critiques of the kind of dominant mechanistic paradigm that one can glean from this. One of the problems that I have here is that I do actually agree with Jonas on many points, but from the position that I'm coming from, they're just kind of like right thinking, that's just like common sense almost from where I'm coming up from. So, which I recognize is not necessarily um the way everybody sees things. Clearly, that's my common sense, my view of it, coming out of a very strong emphasis on life, obviously, given my background and everything. But and this is again why it's really important to critique it, and why when we talked about the blind spot and their deployment of Jonas, like some of what we identified as shortcomings in that treatment. That criticism of the blind spot are really just echoes of the shortcomings of this book. And
Mm,
even a shortcoming we just attributed to Daniel Dennett, although inverted, which is the refusal to really engage with a deep ontology that matches the rest of his thought. And the way that and the polemical and rhetorical aspects of his thought then sort of distort the whole thing in an unfortunate way. It's very much a parallel with Jonas here. And it is, we don't need to dwell on it, and I know you've written about it, but it is epitomized by his engagement with Whitehead. And he says that, what does he say? It's the greatest achievement in 20th century philosophy or whatever. He's very complimentary of Whitehead. Uh,
mhm,
I cannot here discuss this bold proposition of basic ontology, whose intellectual force and philosophical importance are unequaled in our time. Okay, great. Um, that's nice. But what he rejects by fiat without engaging with it, because he just says, I cannot here do that, without really engaging with it, is, like you were saying, the way Whitehead wants to organicize physics, but that's precisely what Jonas needs to do if he wants to capitalize on his own philosophical intuitions and his own critique of the history of science, for example. And it might actually change, even though I'm not necessarily going to affirm precisely Whitehead's perspective on the history of science, but organicizing physics would actually change Jonas's perspective on the mechanical philosophy and potentially give him a capacity to critique it in a deeper manner. But yeah, this passage that you read is an important one. And I mean, yes, uh, it's funny, given his big critique of Darwin, that one of the critiques that a lot of other people have of Darwin is that he renders this, everything in terms of the struggle of all against all, and this Hobbesian view of nature and all of that. And it's like, well, that's pretty strong in what Jonas is saying here. I mean, to be fair, in the next section, he does talk about the paradoxical openness. He gets into a kind of dialectical
Yeah.
discussion of the needful openness of the organism because it needs to. But here we have, in fact, and I know he will, and I'm going to be reading very closely the chapter on cybernetics in my cybernetics reading group, but it's also something I'd like to discuss with you at some point, cybernetics and purpose. But he's actually very strongly taking on board here also the cybernetic view of organisms as open to like thermodynamically open, but organizationally or informationally closed. Because he's saying that the organism is open because it needs energy, right? So it's open because it needs to grab energy from the world. This is just how Ashby describes any cybernetic system, by the way. So that thing that the organizational account and activists and are always quoting, and Jonas is kind of affirming here, and people will identify Jonas with this critique, is actually just like straight cybernetics. That Ashby defines a cybernetic system as one that's thermodynamically open and he says informationally closed. That's a problem. We've talked about that previously. We won't go into that now. But even here, like an identity which from moment to moment reasserts itself, achieves itself, and defies the equalizing forces of physical sameness all around is truly pitted against the,
Mhm.
the the rest of things, but defies the equalizing forces of physical sameness all around. Like that's a description of any frustrated many-body system, and a lot of them are not living. We talked about this a little bit in the natural induction discussion. It's like that's not unique to life. Things being far from equilibrium and kind of resisting equilibrium, by resisting the pathway to equilibrium, resisting collapse to Gibbs's absolute surface, and blah blah blah. That's how you get structure in general, like and the world is very structured, and without that physical structure, and I mean you referenced some of it in terms of order for free and all that, but without that physical structure in the world, there's no life you know and so to talk about the universe of homogeneously interrelated existence and blah blah blah, and obviously he's talked about this a little bit in the Darwinian account, and how there's no and there is a certain, and he's right about this, static nature to the mechanical, obviously, like because all of the information in fact is contained in the initial conditions, and all of the laws of change are there in the timeless entailing laws, right? So things just keep changing, but it's only the appearance of change, blah blah blah, and we all know about the block universe and all of that. But really, there's something that's super important that's being elided here, which is that again, the general evolutionary principle applied to physics and the organicizing of physics, if you want. And we don't have to take all of Whitehead's you know, system and assertions necessarily. Again, we bracket that for now, in order to do that. But to apply evolutionary thought, as indeed has been the story of the post-evolutionary physics ever since Darwin to some extent, is to take this understanding of a differential multiplicity as kind of grounding, as first, and apply it to the genesis of structure in the physical non-living world. And I challenge anybody to come up with an even vague account of the origins of life, and then mind by Jonas's own standards, without, you know, an examination of differential multiplicity in physical systems, and the way structure emerges in non-living systems. And he just kind of he just doesn't he just won't go there, you know. And this is still a problem with any kind of exceptional. And I know you've said, and you're right, that Jonas pushes back against Heidegger's human exceptionalism, but he's still very much a human exceptionalist. He
Oh
still
yeah.
thinks humans are the pinnacle of evolution, to the extent that he affirms evolution, and the most important, like he specifically says, and I get that too, and we talked about this actually last time, like as humans, we do see humans as most important. Um, but there's a way for him that that's an absolute. That's an objective with a capital O, and these are the kinds of sort of Platonic things that, quote unquote, that are very operative in and underpinning his thought, and which to me make it difficult for him to think constructively,
Mm.
because
Yeah.
he's yeah
There was yeah, there's this way in which he almost returns to a kind of Kantian categorical imperative in his bioethics,
yeah
where he says, um, I think in the 70s when he wrote this influential book, The Imperative of Responsibility, he says, act act so that the effects of your action are compatible with the permanence of genuine human life.
genuine human life.
Genuine human life. Um, and I mean, you got stuck on genuine. I got stuck on permanence.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah, yeah,
profoundly unevolutionary idea. There is no permanence.
yeah. But
Any,
they go together, right?
yeah,
Because he's got a
right.
standard, which is the genuine human life, and that is an absolute, and that's
Mhm.
what he wants to make permanent. Because human could mean anything, in terms of its ongoing evolution, right? But it's the permanence of a particular standard, which is again reflected in the way that he talks about, the monstrosity or and that's not unique to him, obviously, but the fact that any deviation from the perspective of the form itself must be considered a monstrosity or an accident or a pathology, and that's exactly the kind of thought that we want a genuine understanding of evolution to get us beyond. That's
Mm,
the kind of, and we know for sure that there are all kinds of totally misguided and shallow applications of evolutionary thought, of allegedly evolutionary thought, um, in affirmation of a certain kind of essentialism of nature. There are two sexes in biology or whatever it might be, right? And it's like, maybe actually study some biology, and maybe also study evolutionary principles. And this is another thing which, again, Dennett, blah blah blah, whatever, he sucks in a lot of ways, rest in peace. But the universal acid idea, right,
mm,
is bang on, because the real core, the essence of evolutionary thought is anti-essentialism. So it's things can, and that's also the essence of explanatory thought, by the way. Like we have to deconstruct things, not because wholes aren't real and wholes don't constrain. It's not eliminative reductionism, but we need to explain more complex things in terms of simpler things. Otherwise, they don't admit of explanation, right?
yeah. No,
Um,
I mean, I like that view, and I just think what Dennett misses is what Whitehead argues so well is that a thoroughgoing evolutionary philosophy is incompatible with materialism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what materialism is, so let's just bracket that. Um,
It's the Crane Skyhooks thing and an understanding of a wholeness as simply additive, which is a pseudo
oh, yeah,
wholeness.
okay, but that's anti-emergence. Like that's all emergence is weak emergence kind of thing. And I mean, physics is incompatible with that. It's like read Phil Anderson or whatever. Like more is different. I don't see that as, I don't know what I don't like isms, because I just worry that they're too. And so people have said, oh well, so it's the anti-ism ism, and I'm like, even Peirce kind of gets this when he talks about, like, he has this terminology which is really difficult to wrap one's head around and everything, obviously. I mean, not to mention the 66 sign types and blah blah blah. But the difference between something like ananchism and ananchism, like, there's ananchism is saying that law has had an effect, as is part of the contribution to evolution, and ananchism would be saying that it was the sole law, vast majority or whatever of the influence. And so in that sense, like all isms need to be relativized, and also they're so polysemous. Like on the one hand, they're absolute, but they're also polysemous, and that's a real problem. And so I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I don't even know if I'm a materialist, right? Like I don't
Yeah.
even.
I mean, when I say materialism or I say idealism in the colloquial sense, I'm talking about the way that Descartes' dualism gets severed into these two extreme schools of thought, which are both equally
Yeah,
um, partial
yeah.
and malformed in the sense that, you know, we can't move forward from Descartes by just choosing one or the other side of his dualism. You have to sort of go upstream prior to that severing. Um, and so, just as I wouldn't want to say simply that, oh, all parts are divided from an original whole, which would be
Yeah.
more like the idealist view. I wouldn't want to just affirm that, nor would I say that, all wholes are just the sum of their parts. I think we need a more complex interplay and again, holding of attention between the two.
You said complex, and that's a key term, right? So
Mm.
in complex systems science, it is precisely incorrect to say that a whole is the sum of its parts. In fact, I mean, as Timothy Morton knows when he has his subscendence, but as David Krakauer would talk about very clearly, but as is kind of obvious, and I've used this example probably in our discussions before, but this is how I've been teaching this for years. It's like you can make a computational model really easily of the emergent wholeness of a murmuration of snarlings, but I defy you to create a good computational model of an individual starling. Wholes are often actually radically less than the sum of their parts. That's because form is constraint, right? So form constrains the degrees of freedom of the microstates, right? So if you understand your thermodynamics, then you're going to recognize this quite directly. So you can't say if a whole is simply the sum, and you can't say that it's more than the sum. That's why the Phil Anderson paper is more is different, right?
Mhm.
Because also, even though he doesn't get into this is a thing about coarse graining, which I've mentioned a number of times because we're talking about coarse graining here. Coarse graining is that a single macro state is consistent with many different arrangements of the microstates. Like that's classic coarse graining, right? And that's the sense in which a whole is less than the sum of its parts. But actually, if you're interested in qualitative emergence, um, and really accounting for that kind of thing through a process of constructive coarse graining, you're going to have to start to understand that you're going to have to start to understand. I will have the answers and I'll give you them. No, I don't have the answers, but coarse graining is very much bidirectional. And this is also very obvious because an incredibly precise and detailed description of the microstates, like you might have with a great physical formalism of some kind that doesn't involve coarse graining, and maybe they all do, um, but that's another another discussion. Like Wolfram would basically say all of the mathematics that we have, and particularly that which applies to physics, is all where computational reducibility exists, right? Pockets of computational reducibility. So that means that all formal models are coarse grainings in that sense. And I mean, that's obviously true. But they're also coarse graining in the other sense that because they're mathematical formalisms, they lack a lot of the qualitative realities of the things that they describe. And that's, we could go into that in this God is a mathematician chapter, which we won't because we're already well over 2 hours. But yeah, there are a lot of trying not to say devils in the details. Damn it, it's like a tick. Two sides of the same coin, devils in the details. Yeah, I know there are certain things that I say all the time. But yeah, it's complex, exactly as you said. So, I of course affirm a kind of holism, but I think holes are constructed. I don't think that they are. I don't want to, because of the cut that makes in reality and in explanation. I don't want to just say that the whole I don't want to just posit the whole. I want to,
Yeah.
if I'm doing the big explanatory project of speculative ontology, I'm diagramming, I'm trying to find the most impoverished thing and build from there.
I'm
Uh,
very happy to say that all wholes are constructed as long as we also say that all parts are constructed.
yeah, well, and all entities are collective in that sense, right? Even the simplest ones. So this would be a generalized thesis of individuation, which someone like Simondon is trying to give
Yeah.
us.
And this is how I think, even though Whitehead has his eternal objects, he's still an anti-essentialist because all enduring form is
Yeah,
social
yeah,
in
yeah,
his account, right?
sure.
And
Yeah,
so it's a neat nuance where he can be still a kind of Platonist
yeah,
and have these definite potentials, but there are no essences in the sense that wholeness in nature is always a collective achievement.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's really, that's actually something that I've said in reviews of Michael Evans' papers, which he's come back and agreed. It's like, in what sense, when we say all intelligence is a collective, is that a big statement when really
Mm.
we're also saying all entities are collective in some sense, right?
Yeah.
Um, so what to show me something that is not substantial in the metaphysical sense, but is enduring in that sense, which isn't a collective. And yeah, like we discussed with Deleuze, and we could say the same about, if I say that Simondon is one of the most thoroughgoing thinkers of Quora first metaphysics, I'm saying that he's a Platonist, but he's still a slightly different Platonist from Whitehead, even. I think he goes a little bit further. Okay, we can stop in a minute. Do you want to really quickly discuss? There's so many things in the Jonas, and I probably should write about it, and it's something we should talk about more anyway another time. Because there are lots of ways. I just think he mischaracterizes actually what science is, to be honest, and
Mm.
that's kind of important. But that's for another day. Um, on the ethical theme where you've led us, and we've sort of, flitted around a little bit since then, you had said, I'd kind of said I didn't want to discuss this, but you had said that you felt that implicit, because he doesn't explicitly say this, although he talks about the connection of Nietzsche's nihilism to Darwinism and blah, blah, blah. But you were
In these
saying,
chapters, he doesn't, but yeah.
okay, right. Well, that Jonas sees an explicit connection between social Darwinism and Nazism. And I wonder if we want to just really quickly
Hmm.
talk about what might be the relationship between, um, Nazism and social Darwinism and Darwin's thought and Darwinism or Darwinian thought or whatever the proper adjective is, for thought that's actually faithful to Darwin.
Yeah, so he mentions Nietzsche in this chapter and Nietzsche's confrontation with nihilism very much having been precipitated by the impact of Darwinism. Again, it's you know not Darwin as a scientist, but the cultural reception of this idea of evolution. Um, Created a cultural atmosphere that was picked up by people like Herbert Spencer and, brought into, I mean, on the one hand, Darwin's already getting his account of nature by borrowing some ideas from Malthus and
And
Adam Smith.
Spencer's older than Darwin and
Mm,
is already giving a kind of generalized evolutionary,
yeah.
account.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's in the air, and I think this removal of any sense of um, a transcendent source of order or purpose or design, and the becoming increasingly incredible of traditional metaphysics, which Nietzsche is so prescient in noticing, sort of as Nietzsche would say, it like unleashes the Earth from its orbit, and now we're just floating in space, and it feels like the only value remaining in this sort of context of just the struggle for the existence where people misinterpret fitness to mean the strongest, and so on, lends itself to an account of human society and economy, and a sort of naturalization of capitalist social relations, where it's the competition among individuals and corporate firms to see who is most evolved and who deserves to survive based on a kind of war of all against all.
mhm.
And whether or not this is a fair, I mean, it's not a fair reading of what Darwin was suggesting, but that's how it got taken up. And so even if whether it's the Soviet understanding of acquired characteristics and the emphasis on how nurture basically is the be all and end all, and every human being is born totally blank slate and we can just enculturate them into what we want them to be, versus the opposite extreme coming from Weissman for the capitalists, where it's, no, we're determined at birth by our genes, and so it doesn't matter how nice you are to the kids of this lower class, they're always going to be stupider, whatever. It was in a sense inevitable that this account of nature free of any transcendent anchor or source of value would end up, I think, leading to some of the tragedies of the 20th century. And so Jonas's project seems to me to be the attempt, and whether or not he succeeds, I don't think he ultimately does. And I didn't go too much into the issues with Zionism as a moral response to Nazism, even though it starts before Nazism, but there were pogroms in Europe for centuries. Uh, then being a moral response to anti-Semitism, and nowadays we can see the consequences of Zionism are equally horrific for that region in Palestine and or Israel. I mean, even what we name it already is controversial. And so I don't think Jonas actually shows us the way forward ethically for all of these complicated reasons, and because of that quote about the categorical imperative, where we want to act it so as to enhance the permanence of genuine human existence, which I'm not a transhumanist, but I also don't think there's any, it's folly to imagine we could just maintain some human essence. Um, what even is that? But his aim, Jonas's aim, is to reestablish some source of morality in this new picture of the universe, of an evolutionary cosmology. And I think Bergson's doing something similar, Teilhard's doing something similar, Whitehead's doing something similar. There are many evolutionary cosmologists who are engaging in that grand form of systematic, metaphysics in an attempt to give us a source of meaning that would not be essentialist, that would not be just a reiteration of preformationism, but that would still retain some sense of um, purpose and meaning that isn't simply what reducible to human beings making it up. So something like human rights. Noval Harari is famous now for saying, "Oh, that's a bunch of bullshit. We make it up." And maybe a more slightly less flippant argument for that would be to say, well, human rights is a function of the institutions we create and the safeguards we put in place. And when those institutions are degraded and people don't respect them anymore, then yeah, human rights becomes up for grabs. But I think there's an intuition that's deeper than just some institution that leads us to a value like the dignity of the human being and the freedom and rights of an individual and so on. And it doesn't need to be that we're created in the image of God, but we need some source or some ground for these values that doesn't leave them up to what is characterized by a kind of, arbitrary um, d desire by this or that group of humans. Like, even if it's clear we always disagree and we'll always be contesting what these values are, or at least how to articulate them, I think what we're in need of right now in a very nihilistic moment, which is over a century and a half long as a extended moment, is like whatever led to the world wars, profound ethical failing that is in some part a consequence of becoming untethered from these transcendent, even though there were wars before, of course, but the attempt in the modern period to bring about some sort of a utopian um, vision through a political project has led to the murder of more people than all prior wars combined, whether we're talking about, Stalinism or we're talking about Nazism. And so, in this modern context, where do we find a source of value? In this evolutionary cosmology, where do we find a source of value? I think that's the project that Jonas is trying to address. And maybe the best I could say is he has some partial successes, but overall, um, the project remains for us to work on.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's also well said. And there's so many things there. Obviously I agree that we have that imperative. I think the thing specifically that I'd want to comment on, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, but is what is the connection of Darwinism, I suppose, just is the theme of our chat to all of that. And I wouldn't want to say that it's not part of it, because it's part of this process of immanentizing, um, and dedualizing, our conception of the world, even though I think that the problem of theodicy and the way that the mechanical philosophy and Laplace again as a quintessential example pronounces so um, definitively on the problem of theodicy. We don't have free will. We just don't have free will because all of the, like, I think determinism is a huge part of the problem here. And I think that, obviously, I think that evolutionary thought is precisely the way out of determinism. Um, so on the Nietzsche thing, it's really interesting because Nietzsche talks a lot about Darwin, but I know and he has some interesting things to say, but some scholars, I've read some stuff on like what is there evidence that Nietzsche had actually read, and there's no evidence that he read Darwin, which is interesting. That he did read people commenting on Darwin, but maybe it's not known that he didn't have a copy of. There's no evidence that he had read even on the Origin of Species, which I think is interesting. Given how much he has to say. And I mean, he does have some pretty penetrating critiques of certain aspects of evolutionary thought,
Mm.
particularly in The Will to Power. He gets into it in a number of places. Even the nominalist critique, there are no transitional forms. It, because every form is, every individual is complete unto itself as a form, right? And I think that's actually an important, even though I'm not a nominalist and it's ironic. Here's the nominalist critique of evolution, where Jonas is trying to claim that Darwinism is the final triumph of nominalism. Um, Nietzsche is levying a nominalist critique. This is the funny. It's like again the Lushenko thing. Like he's saying that Darwinism is overly Platonic. Like it's been so many things to different people, and that's one of the issues here, perhaps. Um, Darwin, of course, signals one of the major challenges for his theory being the relative lack of transitional forms, um, meant in a different way, obviously, from what Nietzsche meant. But then this is one of these places where Darwin's at odds with himself because then he'll talk about transitional forms that we do have. And I would just say that we have, especially in the obviously in the genomic era, we have a very different sense of transitional forms and whether we're lacking them or not. Um, but also just amongst extant species, even in a way that even though Darwin catalogs so much variation and constantly talks about transitional forms amongst varieties and all of that, varieties, species, etc., we have just far more of that kind of stuff. So we're actually inundated with transitional forms, and that again,
Mm.
it's very interesting in the way that it lends this empirical evidence to at the kind of anti-essentialist thing. But on this, yeah, I'm circling this issue.
Mhm.
Um, what is the influence? I mean, the question that I asked you, and I think you all of what you said was really beautiful and really important. I think even again, Jonas does say it himself. Darwinism is not the cause of all of this, but it's one of the major contributors. I think it's the way out of it, personally. But I mean, I think evolutionary thought is, and you mean you've signaled that with some of the names you've dropped there. But I think it's getting out of essentialism. I think we get this crazy apotheosis of essentialism in modern determinism.
Mm.
And I think that's what we need to get out of. And I think that even Jonas mentions that Darwinism is part of the way out of that. But in terms of like direct connections between, you know, Darwinism and Nazism or some of these things. I think I did want to read that quote from Mein Kampf just to show how thoroughly anti-Darwinian Hitler's thought was. So he does say at one point the consequence of racial purity which is characteristic of all animals in nature, is not only a sharp separation of the particular races externally, but also in their uniformity of the essence of that very type itself. The fox is always a fox, the goose a goose, the tiger a tiger, and so on. You can't get any more anti-Darwinian than that. And he also explicitly, in certain speeches, spoke against the ape man hypothesis, right? So the fact that humans could have evolved from other animals was anathema to him. Um, and Okay, and so moving on from that, the Nazi doctrine is not Darwinian in any direct sense, and he never talks about evolution. He never talks about Darwin. So he doesn't even reference social Darwinism, if social Darwinism is supposedly the source of these views. Now, the really problematic thing here, obviously, that people will point to is that certainly in the Descent of Man, Darwin does talk about a hierarchical arrangement of different human races. Some are more evolved than others, and indeed, some have exterminated or near exterminated others because they were more highly evolved races, right? And that's like a pretty nasty, you know, worldview there. How much of a defense of Darwin it is to say that that's not his view in the sense that he didn't originate it, that that was the de rigueur view of his milieu, and that there were many people before him and after him, including Ernst Haeckel, who took it much further than Darwin. And the really important gloss on this is that Darwin is not celebrating that. He thinks it's a real problem. He's an abolitionist. He doesn't think that, even if he does believe that white Europeans, including Jews, by the way, are more highly evolved than Australians or Indigenous Australians that he's putting at the other end. And again, this is all very distasteful, but he doesn't think that that gives us or gives them the right to exploit others. The opposite, actually. He explicitly is against the exploitation of one race by another. And he was also against the people that came to him with sort of incipient notions of eugenics and things like that. And he said that he wasn't strong enough in his condemnation of it, perhaps, but I mean, one cannot be strong enough in one's condemnation of it, so he wasn't. But he did say that it would also, it would degrade our own sense of our own ethical standing if we were to do that to others. So he was kind of like, we must suffer the, you know, the inferior people. So he did have that view again of inferiority and superiority, which some Darwinians have tried to exonerate him from, but he did have that view, and that is obviously a real problem. But
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily bring us to an assertion of a kind of Darwinian evolutionary view of things is not an assertion of like a Matt Ridley style, laissez-faire, or Ayn Rand style laissez-faire economics. Even Dawkins, if he's an arch Darwinian, is against that kind of thing. So he doesn't believe that that's the way things should be. He says that in Selfish Gene and elsewhere. I mean, I'm just trying to. There's a few just little points.
Right. I mean, I would definitely agree it's unfair to draw any direct connections between Darwin or Darwinism and Nazism, for sure, for all the reasons you say. And even with Nietzsche, who mostly because of his sister became associated with Nazism, though, there's more of an association between Nietzsche and
And
that movement than Darwin for sure. But even Nietzsche has this um, sense that Darwinism, as it was popularly understood, and I think I briefly mentioned this idea of fitness being misinterpreted as like the strongest will survive rather than the most adapted to their niche and the most specialized. Um, Nietzsche seemed to think that Darwinism actually, because of the true meaning of fitness, would mean that it's not the strongest or the most powerful that survive. It's those that are most adapted to the herd. And so it leads to its social effects from Nietzsche's point of view would be mediocrity, and a kind of like democratic leveling, which is what he was opposed to. So,
yeah. Whereas for the Soviets, it was too individualist.
right. So I mean, you can interpret these things in so many ways depending on your ideological standpoint, for sure.
Yeah. I think it's also just, again, it's something we'll just touch on, and maybe we'll read some Darwin together at some point. But Darwin has a theory of altruism in the evolution of social beings,
Yeah.
like insects and humans and others, So, there is the root of an ethical theory in there as well.
Mm.
Uh,
Hmm. Yeah, and for a lot of abolitionists, there were plenty of white European abolitionists who were also racist in the sense that they thought that there's this sort of white man's burden thing, as Rudyard Kipling would describe it in his poem, that like, oh, the more advanced races have the duty to help,
yeah.
elevate.
Or it's the human exceptionalism of potentially a Jonas, but of many who say we must be the stewards of nature. It's not it's the same logical relationship.
Hmm. Yeah, though I do think it's always difficult to say anything definitive about the human difference because we're continuous with the rest of the natural world, but Jonas points to um, one potential source of that difference being our capacity to take responsibility for life. And I like that. I do think that there's something about our capacity for ethical responsibility, not just for other human beings, but for life, for the earth, for the community of life on earth as such. And that if we fail to take that responsibility, business as usual, in the current trajectory, we will have done something quite irresponsible.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, I, of course, completely agree. And I mean, it's tried to say with great power comes great responsibility, but we are transforming the world. Our power, our niche construction, the impact of our niche construction is profound. And we do have a responsibility to ourselves as well as to those other organisms that we can celebrate in the way that Darwin would have celebrated them. There is grandeur in this view of life. Darwin is no nihilist. Like, read Darwin, it's a celebration of the natural world. It's not a nihilist view. Um, but yeah, no, I agree with that totally. And I mean, I think mentioned even maybe last time or a couple of times ago, my time in the Philippines with this biologist who was pushing, he was a conservationist, but pushing back on this notion amongst in some conservation movements that wouldn't the world be better off without people? And he's like, well, there'd be no one here to care, you know. Polar bit, anyway. I agree with that, and no, I think it's important to have a nuanced position in these spaces, and of course humans are exceptional, and it's trite to then go and say what I might say, which is, and so brown snakes or whatever, right? Humans are exceptional in very particular human ways. And we are humans. And indeed, we have this incredible power to mold our environment in a way that marginalizes, but doesn't
yeah,
need to marginalize other organisms. And we have this, so this is also the root that we are very potentially altruistic species. And this is why it's so awful how, I mean, it's so hard to bear how awful humans are to one another because of we can all I mean, hopefully we can feel this altruistic aspect of humanity, and hope that it's not characterized in fact in those terms that you drew out of Jonas, in terms of in relation to a hostile other. That altruistic intuition or impulse can spread, and indeed it has spread. But so isn't it fascinating? Yes, the wars in the 20th century killed more people than all wars combined. We never had the power before to kill so many so remotely. um, and that's surely a factor here. But at the same time, if we're into progress, surely there has been a certain kind of progress. Surely the ethical light cone or whatever, our capacity to empathize seems to also have increased, which doesn't mean, oh, fait accompli, it's not a Steven Pinker type view or something like that. There's a lot of problems and new problems to deal with. But it also does seem true that, um, you know, when we speak of Darwin's racism, when we speak of an abolitionist with quite a strong ethical sense that we should care for our other fellow humans as nonetheless a racist in a pretty unpleasant way, um, and say that that was just how most people were at that time, that view today is abhorrent to us, and that's a kind of ethical moral progress. So whilst there's this big challenge of nihilism and the immanentizing of value and all of that has thrown us into a particular kind of problematic where we have a responsibility, in fact, has been put on us rather than on the transcendent. Um, Nonetheless, that has created a lot of problems, but nonetheless, it's also been associated with a certain kind of, dare I say, moral progress. So it's complicated, isn't it? So to characterize the modern period and our untethering from certain transcendent values which were just given to us that we were enculturated in as a kind of backwards move, morally speaking, would seem to be quite a particular and unbalanced reading of the actual situation,
Mm,
notwithstanding just the horrifying things that are still going on right at this very moment. And that's why I'm always a little bit reluctant to discuss these things publicly, obviously, because I find it very overwhelming, and I'm not going to be able to speak particularly lucidly about this stuff because it's
yeah.
it's
No,
you know
I think there have been some um, readings of triumphalist readings of modernity as finally the adulthood of humanity. And I would see it more as the adolescence, in the ancient medieval period. And this is just European history, but that's the childhood of humanity. And then the break with that transcendental source of meaning and value and order um, leads to this adolescent phase where we're a bit rebellious and we were a bit drunk on the power afforded us by technology. And so the killing, which occurs, in the world wars, I think you're right, is a function not so much of us getting so profoundly morally degraded, but the distance that these weapons allow us to take from the actual act. You don't have to stab someone in the heart now. You have a machine gun or you have a bomb drop from an airplane. And even more so nowadays, where everything's automated. It's drones, and the person firing the missile is in Cincinnati and killing people in the middle of Syria or whatever. And it's like very easy to commit murder and justify it by whatever means when you have that kind of technological mediation.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, you're right that drones are different and horrifyingly so, but also someone in Washington signing a piece of paper that kills, how many thousands of people in
the
Hiroshima.
banality of evil is on
Yeah,
our end described it.
exactly. So
Mhm.
that is a very modern problematic, and I think that that's quite distinct in a way from some of the issues that we've been discussing.
Yeah. So, I think we're striving for the actual adulthood of humanity, which in some sense postmodernism, which again, not a term that any of the thinkers usually associate with that term would identify, but that's kind of more like hypermodernism. It's I think more rebelliousness that we would associate with the adolescent phase of modernity. And so we're looking for something um that, as I said at the beginning, is able to draw upon what is still living and relevant about ancient thought, what is so important about some of these modern scientific breakthroughs, and integrate the two in a view that allows us to discover our humanity as something always in the making and open and still in process, uh, but that at least provides us with a sense of orientation in this evolutionary adventure, that we're not just being launched into empty space as nature would have it, but there are lures that we can begin to detect and to feel and to intuit without becoming so attached to any particular lure that it becomes our dogma or some kind of preformation again. Um, but nonetheless would provide us with a um, an anchor that is more than personal preference. Uh, I think there's a way in which, this idea of moral progress became taken for granted by liberals, and we forgot that liberalism actually does have some metaphysical roots to it. And thought people just started describing values like, well, that's our preference, and everyone agrees that we shouldn't hurt each other and stuff. But it turns out that personal preference isn't enough uh, to prevent MAGA or what have or what have you. Um, so yeah. it's a big project and we have our work cut out for us, but just conversations like these that shall contribute. Um,
Well, hopefully. Um, yeah, I mean, there's not much I can say. I agree with so much of what you were saying. I think that misdiagnosing the source of the issue is a way to perpetuate the issue. So just as I think in terms of, the ontology of science, misdiagnosing, we barely touched on that, but misdiagnosing the issues with the mechanical philosophy and its historical origins is a way to perpetuate the mechanical philosophy in a certain sense, because those criticism, I mean, on a much smaller scale, inactivists misdiagnosing the issues with computationalism are one of the, amongst the reasons why those critiques are like water off a duck's back to
mm,
computationalists, because they can just look at that and say, well, you don't understand what we're doing. Um,
right.
so, it's a similar phenomenon here, that there is a real need. Much as I again appreciate Jonas's ethical imperative, there's a real need for very careful work if you want to really sort of, yeah, deconstruct um, the a paradigm that you feel is pernicious or holding us back in some way, or whatever. And of course, there's a need to return to the deep sources. That's what the critique of the mechanical philosophy is growing out of a certain lineage of theology is all about. And then returning, going back to Plato and saying, hey, what about the Cora? That's been kind of marginalized, or
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And I mean, just a final plug for my guy Whitehead when I just find it somewhat ironic that here you have this religious philosopher uh, referring to Whitehead's attempt to organicize physics as frankly speculative, quote unquote, which of course Whitehead's a speculative philosopher, but he's also a mathematical physicist. And so who's better positioned to make these, conceptual transformations than someone who actually does understand the physics at
Yeah.
a very deep level? And for, I think, Jonas to be so quick to dismiss it as just, oh, well, that's just, speculative. One hypothesis there is as good as another. Well, I think there's something more deeply considered in what Whitehead is doing. And Jonas maybe should have taken more of that on board. And he does actually take more of Whitehead on board later on in his
Mm.
when he gets explicitly theological. Um, but yeah, just had to get that in there.
This is, yeah, he says, what does he say? Blah 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 blah. Oh, yeah. No, I've got a bunch of notes here which I'm not going to get into, but yeah, he says that unless we endow, as Whitehead did, the elemental with an inwardness, which by a kind of memory would bridge the discontinuity of actual event, but this is a transference from life and frankly speculative.
Wow.
Um,
And he talks about
yeah,
the continuous path of the particle, which is
yeah.
totally ignorant of quantum mechanics as well. There's not a continuous path of some particles. But yeah.
It's totally ignorant of quantum mechanics, in which there isn't the kind of enduring identity exactly that you're highlighting. Um, but he also doesn't understand that this is another instance in which he doesn't understand the role of formal causation and inheritance, right?
Mm,
Uh, that to the extent that things, even in a classical situation, do follow trajectories and are identifiable over time and are inheriting the conditions of the past in an ongoing manner. Well, he'd need to think evolutionary thought more clearly, maybe, but he'd also just need to understand the role of formal cause in the mechanical philosophy, which he's completely elided. As we said, that path is the formal cause of. I
mhm.
mean, yeah.
Right. Well, um, hopefully that is 3 hours of some digestible ideas that will be of value to someone out there listening.
Hopefully. Well, it was a value to me. It was a value to me to talk, and I really appreciated a lot of what you were saying at the end. I kind of ran out of steam, and yeah, I get very tongue tied around some of the ethical stuff as well. But I very much appreciated the things you were saying there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, likewise, Tim. Definitely important to defend Darwin from misreadings and to sort of revitalize his legacy as a source of some of the paths forward here, um, and not allow these easy caricatures to sort of dominate the reception of
Yeah.
his importance.
clear that it's a big deal, right? Universal acid, Darwin's dangerous idea. Okay, a couple of denatisms, but this thought goes off like a bomb, because it makes evolutionary thought, which was again, de rigueur, uh, current in Darwin's milieu, and also, strongly developed by people like Schelling and obviously Hegel in their ways. In
Herder, a student of Kant's, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In philosophical context, Darwin brings it, like centralizes it in modern science in a very particular way, and it's a very, very big deal. And of course, it's a problematic, it's created some issues of interpretation. It turns out because it's a very, very simple idea, but it's deceptive in its simplicity, you know. And that's why it is actually not a bad idea to read Darwin, because he's not just proposing a principle, he's giving us reams and reams and reams of empirical evidence and saying, well, in a sort of transcendental sense, if this principle, variation, selection, inheritance, schematically speaking, is indeed generic, what can I say about all this variation that I'm uncovering in light of that principle? What does it enable me to say about it? And then he does come up with a lot of different, sort of subsidiary principles, many of which are still very current in biology. But it's worth reading just for the kind of, again, he's not systematic, so he's not that careful on some level because he'll contradict himself all the time. But it's worth reading for the profusion of details and just, I don't know. Yeah, it's worth returning to, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. All right, Tim, I'll let you get on with the rest of your day. I'm gonna
Yeah,
make
you
some
got
dinner
yeah,
and to be continued as always.
yeah. Take care.
See you later.